She had 3 days left before they locked her inside a monster's bedroom forever. 3 days before Lord Garrick's ring was forced onto her finger. 3 days before every dream she'd ever carried was buried beneath silk and submission. So Serena Vale did the only thing a desperate woman with a beating heart could do. She ran. She ran with jewels sewn into her corset, with coin purses strapped against her ribs, with the name of a man she loved burning like a torch in her chest. She ran toward him. And that's when everything shattered. Because the man she ran to was the man who planned to destroy her. Welcome back. Stay until the very end, because this story will break you before it builds you back up. Hit that like button right now and drop the city you're watching from in the comments. Let's begin. The northern wind that howled through Ashevale Keep carried no warmth. It never did. It came off the gray mountains like a warning, threading through stone corridors and rattling iron-latched windows, as though the castle itself was trying to shake loose from its foundations. Serena Vale had grown up inside those walls. She knew every draft, every creak, every shadow that pooled beneath the torchlight after midnight. She knew which floorboards groaned and which ones stayed silent. She knew that the third step from the bottom of the east staircase would betray you if you stepped in the center, but not if you pressed close to the left wall. She had learned all of this the way a prisoner learns a cell, methodically, obsessively, because one day she knew she would need to use it. That night had come. Serena sat at the edge of her canopied bed in the hour before midnight, still dressed in the gown her attendants had fastened her into that morning, a deep burgundy affair with gold threading at the collar, chosen specifically by her father to impress their arriving guests. Lord Aldrich Vale had made his intentions known at supper, between the second and third course, as casually as one announces a change in weather. "The wedding will take place in 3 days," he had said, not looking up from his venison. "Garrick's men arrived at the southern gate this afternoon. Everything has been arranged." 3 days. Serena had set down her fork without a word. She had smiled when smiled at. She had nodded when nodded to. She had excused herself at the appropriate moment and walked upstairs with the measured steps of an obedient daughter. And she had not made a single sound until the door of her chamber closed behind her and she pressed both palms flat against the wood and let the scream that had been rising all through supper die silently in the back of her throat. Lord Garrick. She had met him twice, once at a winter summit 3 years prior, when she had been 16 and he had been introduced as an old friend and ally of your father's. A tall, broad-shouldered man somewhere past his 50th year, with silver hair, a wine-stained beard, and cold eyes the color of old pewter. He had looked at her the way men like him always looked at young women, as an inventory, as something to be assessed for value and acquisition. His first wife had died under circumstances that polite society called unfortunate, and that servants whispered about in entirely different terms. His second wife had fled to a convent in the south and had not come out since, and now he wanted Serena. And her father, Lord Aldrich Vale, the great northern lord who commanded 300 soldiers and sat on the regional council and had spent 19 years teaching his only daughter that family honor was the highest virtue a person could hold. Her father had said yes. She moved to the window and looked down at the courtyard. 2 of Garrick's outriders were still visible near the stables, their torches orange sparks in the dark. More had arrived than her father had led on. She counted the horses. 12, at least. This wasn't just a wedding party. This was an escort, a retrieval. Serena turned away from the window. From beneath her mattress, she pulled out the leather satchel she had been assembling for 6 weeks. Inside, every piece of jewelry she owned that wasn't locked in the vault her father controlled. Rings from her mother's estate, a pearl choker, 2 gold brooches, a sapphire pendant she'd been given at her 15th name day. Beside the jewelry, wrapped in cloth and bound with cord, was every coin she had accumulated across years of birthday gifts, festival allowances, and carefully skimmed household accounts. She wasn't certain of the total, but she knew it was enough. Enough to start somewhere. Enough to matter. She changed out of the burgundy gown herself, her fingers clumsy with the back laces until she simply tore the top 2 free and shrugged out of the thing like shedding a skin. She pulled on dark riding trousers, a thick linen undershirt, and a wool traveling coat that had belonged to a stableman once, and that she had acquired through a deliberate misplacement of a nicer coat near the same peg. She braided her dark hair tight against her skull and tied it off with a strip of leather. She laced her boots. She slung the satchel over her shoulder. She did not look in the mirror. There was a second door in Serena's chamber, not on any official map of the keep, not visible unless you pressed the correct stone on the south wall, while simultaneously lifting the iron ring of the wall sconce. She had discovered it at age 12 while conducting a systematic examination of every room she was allowed in. It led through a narrow passage that ran behind the inner walls, down 2 flights of unlit stairs that smelled of lime and old stone, and emptied through a rusted iron door into the root cellar beneath the kitchen. From the root cellar, it was 40 steps through a tunnel that ran under the outer courtyard wall to a grate that opened in the shadow of the granary, 30 feet outside the keep's main perimeter. She had walked it in daylight twice, alone, memorizing each turn. She walked it now in total darkness, her left hand trailing the stone wall, counting steps in her head, breathing slow and steady in the way she had practiced for exactly this moment. The grate was cold and heavy, but the hinge had been oiled 6 weeks ago by hands other than hers, by hands she had paid for the service and trusted with the reason why, by hands that belonged to Rowan. Rowan Ashby was 24 years old, and he was, by every visible measure, exactly the kind of man that cautionary tales were written to warn young noblewomen about. He was the son of the village blacksmith, which meant he had grown up with fire and iron and the particular confidence that comes from knowing how to make useful things with your hands. He had dark hair that fell across his forehead and gray eyes that caught light in a way that seemed deliberate. And when he smiled, it reached those eyes in a manner that Serena had spent considerable time trying to determine was genuine or performed. He had been shoeing the Vale horses for 2 years. He had first spoken directly to Serena 8 months ago when she came to the stable during a storm to check on her mare and found him mid-repair on a broken wheel axle, singing to himself in the empty building. She had been charmed. Of course she had been charmed. She was 19 years old, confined to a castle, starving for something that felt like a choice, and a handsome young man with clever hands and a warm laugh had spoken to her like a person rather than a political object. She told herself later that she had not been naive, that she had been careful, that she had not given him her trust easily, but she had given it to him. Eventually. Completely. Over stolen meetings in the stable, in the herb garden behind the kitchen, twice in the upper corridor near the library when everyone else was at evening meal, Rowan had listened to her fears about Garrick, about her father, about the life being laid out for her without her consent, and he had said all the things that a man says when he wants a frightened woman to believe she has found her salvation. You deserve better than this, Serena. A woman like you shouldn't be traded like livestock. If you wanted to leave, I'd go with you, wherever you wanted. And 3 weeks ago, when she had finally confided the full shape of her plan, he had taken her hands in both of his and said, I'll be there, I swear it. The North Road Tavern, midnight, 3 days before the wedding. We leave together. She had believed him. She believed him now, walking through the dark tunnel beneath Ashvale Keep, with 40 gold coins and every gemstone her mother had left her pressed against her ribs. She believed him as she pushed through the grate and came up into cold, open air and began the 2-mile walk north along the tree line, moving away from the torchlight of the keep, away from Garrick's horses, away from 3 days in a locked bedroom and a future that had never once asked for her opinion. She believed him as the village came into view. A cluster of low buildings around a central square, the Harrow's Rest Tavern at its far edge, amber light spilling from its low windows onto the packed dirt road. She was 40 feet from the tavern door when she heard the voices. She stopped. She didn't know immediately why she stopped. Some instinct, the same animal instinct that had kept her quiet and watchful for 19 years inside a castle full of people who thought softness and silence were the same thing, made her step off the road and into the deeper shadow of the oak trees that lined the tavern's eastern wall. The voices were coming from a narrow alley between the tavern and the cooperage next door, low, close. 2 voices first, then a third. She recognized the first voice immediately. Doesn't matter. By the time she figures out what's happened, we'll be 3 counties south. Rowan. Unmistakably Rowan. But a version of his voice she had never heard before. Stripped of warmth, stripped of its easy smile, practical and flat as a plank of wood. And she'll just, what? Wander around in the dark? A second voice, male, rougher, older. She's a lord's daughter, Rowan. They'll search for her. Let them search. She'll be alive, won't she? I'm not a killer. A pause. Besides, by the time they find her, the jewels will be sold, and we'll be across the border. Split 3 ways. This haul sets us up for a year at least. She really brought everything? A third voice now, younger, carrying a thread of nervous excitement that made Serena's stomach turn. The mother's estate jewelry, too? Said she had it all on her. Pearl choker, sapphire pendant, the gold pieces from her name day. Rowan's voice dipped briefly into something that might have been self-satisfaction if you didn't listen too carefully. She trusts me completely. Always has. That's the thing about women who've been kept in cages their whole lives. They'll walk straight into your hand if you just hold it open long enough. Silence. Serena did not move. She was not certain she was breathing. The wilderness drop, the rough voice said. You're sure about that? Old logging road. 6 miles north of here, past the last farmstead. I tell her we're cutting through to avoid the main road, which is true enough. Then I tell her to wait with the bags while I scout ahead. Another pause. I never come back. The younger voice laughed. Short, uncomfortable, quickly smothered. She'll be terrified. She'll be fine, Rowan said. Eventually. Probably. His tone suggested he had already stopped thinking about it. Serena stood in the dark for a very long time. Later, she would not be able to reconstruct exactly how long. Her mind was doing something strange, running very fast and very still simultaneously, like a wheel spinning in mud. The part of her that had walked 2 miles through the cold and planned this escape for 6 weeks was still trying to process the words she had just heard. The part of her that was 19 years old and had believed, with a terrifying sincerity, that she had finally found one person in the world who saw her as something other than a resource. That part was performing a quiet, catastrophic collapse somewhere deep in her chest. She pressed her back against the stone wall of the cooperage. She breathed. She thought. Go back, said one part of her. Go back to the keep. Slip through the grate, up the stairs, back to your room. Burn the satchel. Wear the burgundy gown. 3 days from now, be what they need you to be. At least you'll be safe. She knew what safe looked like, in that version. She had been looking at it her whole life. It looked like her mother, a quiet woman with beautiful hands who had developed a persistent cough in the 3rd year of her marriage to Lord Aldrich and had not recovered from it, who had given Serena the sapphire pendant on her 15th name day with a smile that didn't quite reach her eyes and said, Be clever, my darling. Whatever else they take, keep that. Her mother had not kept anything. She had been dead 4 years. Serena pushed herself off the wall. She was not going back. She was not marrying Garrick. And she was not handing a single coin to Rowan Ashby. But she also, and this was the cold, clarifying calculation that cut through the grief and the fury like a blade, had nowhere left to go. Her plan had been built around one person, and that person had just revealed himself to be a mechanism for her destruction. She had no horse. She had no shelter. She had no allies, no contacts beyond her father's sphere of influence, no route north or south that would get her beyond the reach of the Vale name before morning. She had jewels. She had coin. She had darkness and a head start. What she needed was a solution she hadn't thought of yet. She stepped away from the cooperage wall and moved along the tree line toward the tavern's front entrance, keeping her head down, processing. Options. Hire a driver tonight. But the drivers in this village worked for her father or feared him. Find a traveler passing through who'd take coin for company and speed. Possible, but transactional strangers on a midnight road were not reliably safe. Reach the monastery at Veld Cross, 20 miles east. But 20 miles on foot was 2 days at least, and Garrick's men would be riding at dawn. She was thinking so hard she didn't see the man standing at the edge of the tavern door until she walked directly into him. She hit something solid, a chest, broad and immovable as a stone buttress, and staggered back 2 steps, nearly losing her footing on the frozen ground. The satchel swung hard against her hip. A hand caught her elbow before she could fall, steadying her with an ease that was almost insulting, given how completely she had failed to notice him. Careful, the man said. She looked up. He was tall, several inches above 6 feet, which meant she had to tilt her head back to see his face properly. He wore a plain traveling cloak, dark, without insignia. The kind of garment designed specifically to communicate nothing about the person wearing it. His hair was dark and pushed back from his face in a way that suggested he had been riding recently. His features were sharp and well-defined, the kind of face that would have been called handsome if it weren't quite so severe, and his eyes, catching the amber spill of light from the tavern window, were the color of whiskey held up to firelight. He looked at her with an expression that was not quite amused and not quite neutral, somewhere in the precise middle, like a man watching an interesting game whose outcome he hasn't yet decided to care about. "You look," he said, in a voice that was low and unhurried, like someone who just discovered something they very much did not want to know. Serena stared at him. "I'm fine," she said. Her own voice came out steadier than she expected. "I wasn't watching where I was going." "No," he agreed. He had released her elbow. "You were watching somewhere else entirely." She took a step to the side, intending to move around him. "Wait." He didn't reach for her. He just said the word, and something in the quality of it made her stop. Not out of fear, but out of the same instinct that makes you stop when someone says listen in a particular tone of voice. "You're carrying something heavy," he said, not referring to the satchel. "And you're trying to think your way out of a corner." Serena looked at him for a long moment. "Do you always make pronouncements about strangers you've collided with by accident?" "Only when the strangers are interesting." He tilted his head slightly, and clearly about to make a very desperate decision. "You don't know anything about my situation. I know you're dressed for hard travel and it's past midnight. I know you just came from the side of that building." He glanced toward the cooperage alley without turning his head. "And whatever you heard there has made you look like someone who has swallowed something sharp. I know you're wearing the boots of a working stable or a serious rider, not a woman of leisure, but the coat is cut for someone larger, which means it's borrowed or taken." His amber eyes returned to her face. "And I know you're calculating very hard right now. I can see it." She held his gaze. "I need to get out of this village tonight," she said, not because she had decided to trust him, because she was out of time and he was standing there, and sometimes desperation reaches a hand out in the dark and touches something unexpected. "I need to be beyond the northern reach of Lord Aldrich Vale by dawn. I have coin and jewelry sufficient to pay for a great deal of assistance." She paused. "Do you have a horse?" The man looked at her with those amber eyes for a moment that stretched like pulled thread. "I have 6, he said. She blinked. 6 horses. And 12 men. She recalibrated. This was not a traveler. This was something else. The plainness of his cloak was not poverty. It was the studied anonymity of someone who moved through the world without wanting to be identified. She looked at him more carefully, the quality of his boots, the leather of his belt, the way he stood, weight balanced, at ease but not careless, the way men stood when they were accustomed to having people look at them and were no longer affected by it. "Who are you?" she asked. He almost smiled. It was less than a full smile. The suggestion of one, a quarter turn of the corner of his mouth that managed somehow to be more expressive than most people's full expressions. "Someone who might be able to help you," he said, "if you'll hear me out." "That's not an answer to my question." "No," he agreed. "It's not." He stepped back from the doorway and made a slight gesture toward the cold dark of the road. "Walk with me. I'll explain." Serena thought about Rowan in the alley. She thought about Garrick's horses in the courtyard. She thought about 3 days. She walked with him. They moved along this tree line, away from the tavern, far enough that their voices would not carry. The night was very still, the stars hard and close in the black sky, the snow from last week's fall packed down into icy ridges along the road's edge. Serena kept her distance from him, 2 arm lengths, and watched his hands. He kept them loose at his sides, unhurried, making no move toward her. "Your name," he said. It was somewhere between a question and a statement. "You first," she said. That quarter smile again. "Kael." No surname, no title. She filed that. "Serena," she said. "Serena Vale." Something shifted almost imperceptibly in his expression. He had heard the name. She watched him process it. Vale, he repeated. Lord Aldrich's daughter. The very same. She kept her voice flat. Which means I have approximately... She looked at the stars, estimated. 4.5 hours before my absence is discovered and the hunting parties go out. 3.5 if one of the servants checks early. She looked at him directly. You said you could help me. I need to be out of the Northern Territory entirely. I need to be somewhere my father's name carries no authority. And I need a legal severance from the marriage contract he signed with Lord Garrick. She paused. That last part is the difficult one. Cale was quiet for a moment. Around them the wind shifted, carrying the smell of pine resin and ice. There is a way to void a noble marriage contract under Northern Territorial law, he said. I know, Serena said. A prior claim. An existing legal union. She had read every law book in her father's library. She had read them specifically looking for this. If I were already married, by any recognized authority, the Garrick contract would be unenforceable. But there's no magistrate in this village who would perform a ceremony before morning without my father's written consent, and the nearest temple is... I'm not talking about a temple ceremony, Kyle said. She stopped walking. He had stopped a step ahead of her and turned to face her. In the starlight, his eyes were darker than they had been in the lamplight. Less amber now, more gold, with something moving in them that she didn't have a word for yet. There's an older form of union, he said. One that predates the noble contract system. Predates most law, actually, in these territories. He paused. You know what I am. Serena looked at him. She had not, until that precise moment, let herself consider it. But standing here in the dark with the wind off the mountains and the stars above, and something in his bearing that was not quite human in its stillness, she thought about the amber in his eyes, and the 12 men waiting with 6 horses, and the complete absence of any fear in his manner, and she did the arithmetic. Werewolf, she said. Alpha, he said. The distinction in his voice was quiet but absolute. There is a claiming bond, ancient, unbreakable, recognized across every territory in the realm, because it cannot be faked or forged. It cannot be voided by any court because it operates outside court jurisdiction. It is not a political contract. He held her gaze steadily. It is permanent. The word landed between them like a stone into still water. Permanent, Serena repeated. I would not deceive you about that, Kyle said. And something in his voice, some quality she would spend a long time afterward trying to precisely identify, a kind of bare plainness that had no performance in it anywhere, made her believe him in a way she had not believed Rowan in 8 months of careful, practiced warmth. It is not a temporary arrangement. It cannot be undone. A claiming bond made under a full moon is witnessed by nature itself. There is nothing in this world that can unmake it once it is made. You are proposing, Serena said slowly, to permanently bond yourself to a woman you met 11 minutes ago in the dark outside a tavern. I'm proposing to give you a solution to your problem, he said. What happens after that? A pause. We would figure out together. You don't know anything about me. I know you planned your own escape. I know you listened in the dark instead of running when you heard the truth. I know you didn't collapse when your plan fell apart. You started building a new one. He looked at her steadily. I know you're not afraid of me. She held his gaze. She should have been afraid. She was aware, in some analytical corner of her mind, that she should have been afraid. She was standing in the dark with a werewolf alpha she had met minutes ago who was proposing a permanent supernatural bond as a solution to a marriage contract. By any rational framework for risk assessment, this was worse than the problem she was trying to solve. Except Lord Garrick. Except her mother's cough and the smile that hadn't reached her eyes. Except Rowan's voice in the alley, flat and practical. She'll be fine, eventually, probably, already not thinking about it. Except the sapphire pendant against her ribs and her mother saying, "Be clever, my darling," whatever else they take. The bond, Serena said carefully. What does it mean, practically? What does it require of me? Loyalty, Kyle said. Honesty. The same I would give you in return. He was quiet for a moment. Nothing else is required that you don't choose. And you, who are you, really? You said no surname. For a moment he was still in the way that very large, very powerful animals are still, not frozen but coiled, the absence of movement that is itself a kind of presence. That answer, he said, would significantly change your calculation. Tell me anyway. He watched her for a moment. Kael Ironclaw, he said, king of the Ironclaw realm. The wind moved through the pines. Serena stared at the man standing in front of her in a plain traveling cloak, with his hands loose at his sides and the weight of 1,000 miles of wild territory in his bearing, and she thought, of course. Of course he was a king. Of course the man she had walked into in the dark, in the worst night of her life, with everything she owned strapped to her body and every backup plan already burned, was a king. She thought about going back. She thought about it with a strange, almost nostalgic completeness. Standing at the keep window, Garrick's horses in the courtyard, the burgundy gown on the floor, she thought about what it felt like to already know every draft and every creak and every groaning floorboard of your own imprisonment. "All right," Serena Vale said. Kael looked at her. "All right? All right." She met his eyes, gold and ancient and entirely, utterly serious. "Show me what a claiming bond looks like." The clearing was 40 paces off the road, deep enough into the tree line that no torchlight from the village reached it. The snow was undisturbed there, pale and blue-white in the moonlight, and the pines stood around the perimeter in a silence that felt deliberate, like witnesses gathering. Kael's men. She had not seen them, but she understood they were there, a perimeter of unseen presence around the clearing's edge, stayed back. She felt them the way you feel the edge of a fire, a warmth at the periphery, a direction of heat. Kael stood before her in the center of the clearing and removed his cloak. Beneath it he wore a riding coat, dark, and beneath that, she noticed this the way you notice something you are trying not to notice. The build of a man accustomed to real physical hardship, broad through the shoulder, lean, the kind of physicality that belonged to the field, not the court. "Your hand," he said. She extended her right hand. He took it, his grip firm but careful, as though she were something he was determined not to damage, and turned it palm up. He held it in both of his for a moment, looking at it, and then he looked up at her. "This is permanent," he said, one final time. Not a warning. A certainty he was offering her the chance to hold and examine before she accepted it. "I know," she said. He nodded, almost imperceptibly. What happened next was not like anything she could have described in the language she had been given. There was a sound, not quite audible, more felt than heard, like a note too low for ordinary ears, and a warmth that began in her palm and moved through her wrist and upper arm like water rising, unhurried and inevitable. When Kael bowed his head and pressed the mark of the bond against the side of her neck, not painful, more like the impression of a seal pressed into warm wax, she felt the thing settle into her the way a foundation stone settles, heavy, sure, and permanent. When she opened her eyes, the clearing was exactly the same, the snow was exactly the same. The pines stood in exactly the same silence. Serena raised a hand and touched the side of her neck. She could feel the mark there, a warmth, a faint raised texture, a thing that was now as much a part of her as her own pulse. She looked at Kael. He was watching her with those amber eyes, and in them was something she would spend weeks learning to name. Not possession, not satisfaction, but recognition. The look of a man who had found something in a direction he had not expected to look. "We ride at dawn," he said. "We ride now," Serena said. He looked at her for a moment. Then, for the first time, he smiled. Fully. The quarter turned becoming something real and unguarded, a thing she suspected did not come out often into the light. "Now," he agreed. And the 12 men materialized from the tree line, and the horses were brought, and Serena Vale, her father's daughter, Lord Garrick's intended, Rowan Ashby's mark, the girl who had been a pawn since birth, swung herself up into the saddle and rode north into the dark. Behind her, the torches of Ashvale Keep grew smaller and finally disappeared. She did not look back. She did not know, riding through that first cold dawn with the king's company around her and the bond warm at her throat, what morning would bring when she walked back through her father's doors, marked, claimed, and no longer his to give away. She would find out soon enough. The first gray light of dawn found them 4 miles north of the village, moving at a steady canter along the old pine road that cut through the heart of the northern forest. Serena rode between 2 of Kael's men, not as a prisoner, she told herself, but as someone whose safety had become a logistical concern for 12 people who did not yet know what to make of her. The horses were excellent, better than excellent. Even in the dark and the cold, she could feel the quality of the animal beneath her. The deep, even stride, the responsiveness, the kind of breeding that cost more than most northern lordships earned in a tax year. She filed that away alongside everything else she was filing. Kael rode ahead, slightly apart from his men, and she watched the set of his shoulders in the darkness, the easy, habitual posture of a man who had been on horseback his entire life. He had not spoken to her since the clearing. Neither had she. There was a quality to the silence between them that was not uncomfortable so much as careful, the way you are careful with something new that you don't yet have the right vocabulary for. The bond at her throat was still warm. She had touched it 3 times in the past hour without meaning to, her fingers finding it the way your tongue finds a new tooth. It was real. She knew it was real. What she did not yet know was what real meant, in the full weight of the morning that was coming. Kael pulled his horse up at the crest of a long rise and turned to look back the way they had come. Serena drew up beside him. From here the forest spread south in a dark, unbroken mass, and far at its edge, barely visible, the torchlight of Ashvale Keep glittered like trapped stars. "They'll have found my room empty by now," she said. "Yes." Kael studied the distant lights. "Your father will send riders." "He'll send more than riders," she said. "He'll send word to every allied house in the territory. By mid-morning, my name will be on every road gate between here and the border." She paused. "He's thorough." Kael looked at her then. In the early dawn, his amber eyes were very clear. "Are you afraid of him?" She considered the question with the seriousness it deserved, the way she had learned to consider every question that mattered, without flinching away from the honest answer. "I'm afraid of what he can set in motion," she said. "I've never been afraid of him personally. He doesn't hit, he doesn't threaten." She looked at the distant lights. "He just arranges. He moves people the way you move pieces on a board, and he's very good at it, and he never once asked me if I wanted to be a piece." She paused. "That's a different kind of fear. It's quieter." Kael was quiet for a moment. "We won't run," he said. She turned to look at him. "What?" "Running will take 3 days to clear the territory, which gives your father 3 days to build a legal challenge, contact Garrick's house, potentially assemble enough political pressure to contest even the bond under emergency provisions." He held her gaze. "I don't run from anything, and you don't need to." "You're suggesting we go back." "I'm suggesting," he said, with the calm of a man announcing a minor schedule change, "that we ride to Ashvale Keep at first light and walk through the front door." The forest was very quiet around them. Serena looked at him for a long moment. "That," she said, "is either the most strategically sound decision I've heard tonight or the most arrogant." "It can be both," he said. She thought about it. She thought about it the way she had been trained, without sentiment, laying the variables out in her head like a map. Her father's power within the territory was considerable, but it was political power, human power, the accumulated weight of alliances and contracts and favored positions on the council. It was power that operated inside a system. And Kael was something the system had never quite figured out how to contain, because he was the king of a realm that sat outside the system entirely, that had its own laws and its own ancient authority that predated every noble house in the north by several centuries. The Ironclaw realm. She had read about it. Everyone in the northern territories had read about it, or heard about it, or been frightened by it at the appropriate age. It was not a myth, precisely. It was too consistently documented in too many independent historical accounts for that, but it occupied the territory between documented fact and living legend that made people uncomfortable. A kingdom beyond the wild northern passes, governed by pack law rather than noble law, ancient and self-contained and famously unmoved by the political weather of the human territories that surrounded it. And its king was sitting on a very good horse 6 inches to her left, watching the torchlight of her father's castle, with the expression of a man watching something he has already decided the outcome of. "All right," Serena said, for the second time in 8 hours. He looked at her again with that quality of recognition. "You keep saying that," he said. "I keep meaning it," she replied. He turned his horse south. She turned hers and followed, and the 12 men fell in around them, and they rode back toward the castle as the sky went from black to the color of old pewter, and then to the pale, flat gray of a northern morning, cold and honest and clear. The gates of Asheville Keep were shut. Of course they were shut. Serena had expected them to be shut. What she had not expected, and she catalogued this reaction with a cool, interior surprise, was the number of people assembled on the road outside them. There were perhaps 30, gathered in the uncertain light between the castle's outer wall and the tree line of the approach road. Soldiers in her father's colors, village men who had apparently been roused early and pressed into some form of service, 2 riders bearing Garrick's insignia who had clearly been standing at the gates when whatever alarm was raised began. And standing at the center of this loose gathering, wrapped in a heavy cloak, his breath fogging in the cold air, was Lord Aldrich Vale himself. He was not a tall man. Serena had always noticed that, the way children notice the disparity between the size of a parent's authority and the size of their body. He was compact, gray-haired, with a sharp face and sharper eyes, and the permanent slight tension around his jaw that came from a lifetime of maintaining control through the application of sustained, careful pressure. He did not rage. He did not shout. He waited, and he calculated, and he applied pressure at the points he had identified as load-bearing. He was looking at Serena with those sharp eyes now, and in them she could see the calculation happening in real time, reading her, reading the riders around her, reading the quality of the horses and the bearing of the men, reading the stranger who rode at her left side in a plain traveling cloak with the amber eyes and the set of a man who had never in his life been required to explain himself. "Serena." Her father's voice was controlled. Not warm, not cold. Controlled. "Come down from the horse." "Good morning, father," she said. She did not come down from the horse. His eyes moved to Kael. A longer assessment. The kind of assessment that was trying to place a person in a hierarchy and finding no obvious slot. "You," he said. "Who are you, and what is your business on Vale land with my daughter?" Kael said nothing for a moment. He sat on his horse with the same unhurried, self-contained stillness he had had in the clearing, and he looked at Lord Aldrich Vale with those amber eyes, and Serena had the distinct sensation of watching 2 different kinds of authority try to identify each other across a very short distance. "My business," Kael said, "is with your daughter, and I'd suggest having this conversation inside rather than in a road." "You'd suggest," Lord Aldrich repeated. His voice had gone very flat. "You're on my land, stranger. You'll answer my questions before you suggest anything." "Father," Serena pulled her horse a half step forward, "let us through the gate. What I have to tell you, you'll want to hear it in the great hall, not in a road with 30 people listening." Something moved in Lord Aldrich's eyes. He was reading her again, reading the steadiness in her voice, reading the absence of the fear he had been expecting, reading the mark on her throat. She watched him see it. She watched his face do something complicated and then return to stillness. "Open the gate," he said quietly, to the soldier nearest him. The great hall of Asheville Keep was lit by the morning's first fire, the logs still settling and spitting in the wide hearth. The long table ran the length of the room, set for no meal, its dark wood bare and practical. Torches guttered in their iron brackets. The servants who had been dispatched to light the hall had been sent back out, and the only people remaining when the doors were pushed closed behind them were Lord Aldrich, Serena, Kael, 2 of Kael's men who had followed silently through the gate without being asked permission and without being stopped, and, Serena noticed with a flat internal acknowledgement, Lord Garrick's 2 representatives, who had apparently decided their presence was relevant. They were standing near the far wall. A thin, precise man in dark wool named Steward Holt, who handled Garrick's external affairs, and a younger man whose name Serena didn't know, but whose expression suggested he was here to observe and report rather than participate. Lord Aldrich positioned himself at the head of the table. He looked at Serena across its length. "Explain yourself," he said. Gladly, Serena said. She had rehearsed nothing. She had no prepared speech. What she had was 19 years of watching her father operate, which meant she knew exactly how he assessed information and exactly what order to present it in to be effective. I didn't run, she said first, because that would be his primary concern. The exposure, the political liability of a runaway daughter. I'm here. I came back willingly. She let that settle. Because I have something to tell you that changes the contractual landscape of this entire arrangement, and you need to hear it from me directly before you hear it from anyone else. Lord Aldrich's eyes moved briefly to Kyle and then back to her. What arrangement? The Garrick contract, she said. It's void. The thin man near the wall made a small, indignant sound. Lord Aldrich did not make any sound. He looked at her steadily. On what grounds? Serena raised her chin and touched the mark at her throat with 2 fingers, deliberately, making sure he could see it. Prior claim, she said. Executed last night under a full moon, witnessed by nature and by 12 men of the Ironclaw realm. She paused. I am claimed. The bond is permanent and carries the full authority of ancient pack law, which supersedes noble contract in every territory where werewolf sovereignty is recognized. She met her father's eyes, which is every territory. The silence that followed this was the kind that has texture. Stuart Holt's thin face had gone through several shades of color and arrived at something between outrage and careful recalibration. The younger man at the wall was writing something. Lord Aldrich had not moved. You, he said very quietly to Kyle. You did this. She asked me to, Kyle said. He had taken a position slightly behind and to Serena's left, not protecting her, not looming, just present. A gravitational weight in the room that everyone was orienting themselves around without having been asked to. She's 19 years old, Lord Aldrich said. Old enough to make binding contracts in every legal system I'm aware of, Kyle said, including yours. Lord Aldrich's jaw tightened. He looked at Serena with those sharp eyes, and she could see him doing the arithmetic, trying to identify who this man was, trying to understand the authority that was simply emanating from him without announcement, trying to work out what asset he was dealing with and whether it could be leveraged or needed to be absorbed. You haven't told me your name, Lord Aldrich said to Kyle. His voice was very controlled now. Or your house. Kale reached into the interior of his traveling cloak and withdrew a small object, a seal, flat and round, black stone set in gold, which he placed on the table between them and did not push toward anyone. He simply placed it there and let Lord Aldrich see it. Serena watched her father look at the seal. She watched him read it. She watched his face do the complicated thing again, and this time it took longer to return to stillness. The Ironclaw seal was unmistakable. It was in every history book, every territorial treaty compendium, every record of the northern lands going back 200 years. It was as immediately recognizable as sunrise to anyone who had spent a life in northern politics, which Lord Aldrich Vale had spent 4 decades doing. You, Lord Aldrich said. The word came out differently than the previous one had. Lord Vale, Kyle said. He did not say your grace or my lord because he was not required to. He was not under anyone's authority in this room. He was the highest authority in this room. And they both knew it now, and the balance of the conversation had shifted completely in the space of a single-placed seal. Serena watched her father's face very carefully. She had expected rage. She knew his rage. The controlled, cold variety, the pressure application. She had expected it to be directed at her, at Kyle, at the situation. What she had not expected was what came instead. A flicker, very brief, of something that looked almost like relief. It was there and gone so quickly she nearly missed it, but she had spent 19 years reading her father's face across tables, and she had not missed it. And in the space of that flicker, she understood something she had not understood before. Something that changed the shape of the morning entirely. Her father had not been pleased about the Garrick arrangement. He had made it. He had announced it. He had arranged the riders and the timing and the public presentation of it. But he had not been pleased. He had been doing what he always did, which was the most politically expedient thing in a landscape where he felt he had no better option. And now a better option had walked through his front gate wearing a plain cloak and carrying the Ironclaw seal, and Lord Aldrich Vale was doing the arithmetic on whether losing the Garrick alliance was survivable if what he gained in exchange was a connection to the most powerful alpha sovereignty in the northern world. Serena felt a complicated and unfamiliar emotion move through her. Not forgiveness, not yet, not anywhere near yet, but something adjacent to understanding, which was its own kind of terrible, because understanding your enemy made it harder to stay angry at them, and she needed to stay angry at her father for a while longer. She needed the anger. It was a structural element in what she was building. "Steward Holt," Lord Aldrich said, without looking away from Kyle. "My lord." Holt had pulled himself together into a professional stiffness. "Inform Lord Garrick's house that the contract is under review," Lord Aldrich said, "pending examination of prior claim documentation." Holt's mouth opened. "Now," Lord Aldrich said. Holt closed his mouth. He collected himself with visible effort and left the hall, the younger man trailing behind him like a shadow. The doors closed. Lord Aldrich looked at his daughter across the bare table. "Sit down, Serena," he said. "I'll stand," she said. He looked at her for a moment. Something moved through his sharp eyes. "You planned this." "I planned an escape," she said. "The rest was improvisation." "The rest," he said, "is a political realignment that will take me 6 months to manage." "Then you'd better start today." He looked at her with something that was not quite pride, and not quite anger, and not quite grief. Some combination of all three that she had never seen on his face before, which meant it was new, which meant she had done something he had not anticipated, and Lord Aldrich Vale had spent 40 years anticipating everything. "Who told you about the claiming bond?" he said. "No one told me. I found it in your law library when I was 15, she said. "The Compendium of Ancient Territorial Rights, third shelf, north wall. You never locked that room." He was quiet for a moment. "I didn't think I needed to." "No," Serena said. "You didn't think I was reading." Another silence. The fire settled in the hearth. "The Garrick contract had financial penalties for breach," Lord Aldrich said finally. "Not a threat. An administrative fact. Significant ones." "I know," Serena said. "I read the contract too. Third drawer, your study desk. It was never sealed." She paused. "The Vale estate holds approximately 14 months of operating reserve at current expenditure. The penalty is substantial but survivable with 6 months of adjusted outflow if you renegotiate the Western Timber contracts this spring." She met his eyes. "Which I assume you were planning to do anyway." Lord Aldrich looked at his daughter for a very long time. "You read my financial records," he said. "You left them in a room I was allowed in," she said. Kyle had been standing silently through all of this with the patience of a man who understood that some conversations needed to run their course without interference. Now he looked at Serena with those amber eyes, and she caught the edge of something in them. Not amusement exactly, but its more serious relative. Respect, possibly. The kind that doesn't announce itself. "I'll need the claiming documentation drawn up formally," Lord Aldrich said at last. "A record filed with the Territorial Registry. If this is to hold against Garrick's legal challenges." "I have scribes traveling with my party," Kyle said. "The documentation will be complete by this afternoon." Lord Aldrich absorbed this. He nodded once, the nod of a man performing an internal restructure and maintaining adequate dignity throughout. "You'll stay tonight," he said. It was not quite an invitation. It was not quite a command. It was the acknowledgement that things had changed, and that the new shape of them required a new kind of hospitality. "Tonight," Kyle agreed. Lord Aldrich looked at Serena one more time, and then he did something she had not seen him do in 4 years, maybe longer. He looked away first. She stood in the great hall of the house she had grown up in, with the fire at her back and the bond warm at her throat, and she felt the shift in the room settle around her like weather changing, like a season turning. Outside, the morning was fully bright now. The problem she had not accounted for was the village. She understood this approximately 2 hours later when she stepped out into the inner courtyard for air and found 3 of the house servants gathered near the water pump, talking in the low, urgent tones of people sharing information they consider both important and dangerous. They separated when they saw her, not hastily, but with the deliberate, practiced naturalness of people who had been separating when she appeared their whole lives. She stopped. What's being said? She asked, directing the question at the oldest of the three. A woman named Bretta, who had worked the kitchen for 20 years and who had the honest, unvarnished face of someone who found dishonesty too exhausting to bother with. Bretta looked at her with an expression that was not unkind but was very direct. That you ran off in the night with a stranger, my lady, and came back with a mark on you like a brand. It's not a brand, Serena said. I know what it is, Bretta said, which was slightly surprising. My grandmother was from Pack territory. I know the bond. She paused. It's the others that don't. What are the others saying? Bretta's expression did the specific thing that honest faces do when they're about to say something that could get them in trouble. They're saying you've been spelled, that a wild alpha caught a lord's daughter and marked her like property and dressed it up in fancy legal language. She folded her hands in front of her apron. They're saying Lord Garrick's men have been talking to people in the village since dawn, telling them the bond is a savage custom, not a legal one, that it doesn't count under proper civilization. Serena stood very still. And Rowan Ashby, Bretta added, with the careful specificity of someone delivering the worst part last. He's been at the tavern since early morning talking to anyone who'll listen, saying you've lost your mind, saying the alpha took advantage of a frightened girl. She looked at Serena steadily. He's telling people he tried to help you last night, that he was waiting for you, that you never showed. The courtyard was quiet around them. 2 soldiers passed on the far side without looking over. A horse stamped in the stable block. Serena's jaw was very tight. How many people are listening to him? Enough, Bretta said, with a simplicity that was worse than any elaboration. She found Kyle in the upper gallery, standing at one of the long windows that looked out over the approach road. He had removed the traveling cloak and stood in a dark riding coat, and in the flat morning light he looked less like a man who had been riding through the night and more like something that simply existed and had existed for a long time, solid and unhurried, watching the road with the patience of someone who was used to waiting for things to arrive. 2 of his men were near the door. They withdrew when she entered without being asked. Rowan is in the village telling people I was coerced, she said, without preamble. Kyle turned from the window. He looked at her with those amber eyes, and she could see that he had already known, or had suspected, which meant his people had already been watching. Yes, he said. Garrick's steward is still in the village, she said. He left the hall, but he didn't leave the territory. Also, yes. They're building a public case, Serena said. Not a legal one, not yet. A social one. If they can establish in the court of village opinion that the bond was coerced, or that I was not of sound mind, they create enough ambient doubt that when they bring the legal challenge, your documentation won't be enough by itself. They'll need witnesses who contest it. She felt the shape of the problem clearly now, the way you feel the shape of a dark room when your hands find the walls. My father's support is contingent on political calculation. If enough pressure accumulates, from Garrick's people, from the village, from allied houses who don't want to cross Garrick's network, he will recalculate. He always recalculates towards survival. Then we need to remove the pressure, Kyle said. How? He was quiet for a moment. Not the silence of someone who doesn't have an answer, the silence of someone deciding how much of the answer to say at once. Rowan Ashby, he said. What he did last night, the scheme, the conversation you overheard, is not a private matter. It's a criminal one. Theft by deception targeting a noble's daughter. Conspiracy. Abandonment in hostile wilderness. He paused. Under Northern territorial law, those charges, brought publicly, strip a man of his status entirely. Any testimony he gives after formal charges are filed carries no weight in any proceeding. Serena looked at him. You want to bring formal charges against Rowan? I want to bring public charges, Kyle said. There's a difference. Formal charges go to a closed court. Public charges go to the village square. His amber eyes were steady. Every person who heard Rowan this morning hears the truth this afternoon. Every person who was told you were coerced sees the man who actually tried to harm you named and stripped before them. She understood what he was proposing. It was strategically sound and she could feel that clearly. But it also meant standing in a village square and having the conversation she had been trying not to have. about the night before, about the tunnel and the satchel and 8 months of manufactured warmth, about being exactly that naive in exactly that public a way. "I'll look like a fool," she said. "Not self-pity. Assessment." "You'll look like someone who survived," Kyle said. He held her gaze. "That is a different thing." She stood in the gallery with the morning light flat and clear through the long windows and thought about Bretta's face in the courtyard. Enough people are listening to him. She thought about her mother's hands and the smile that hadn't reached her eyes. She thought about what survival actually looked like, the full cost of it, the difference between surviving quietly and surviving in a way that meant something. "All right," she said. His mouth did the thing that was almost a smile. "You keep saying that." "I keep meaning it." She looked out the window at the approach road, at the cold, bright morning, at the distant shape of the village rooftops. "But I want to be the one who stands up and speaks. Not you, not your men." She turned to look at him directly. "Me." He studied her for a moment. Not with doubt, she thought, with the particular attention of someone recalibrating an estimate they had already set high. "You," he said. "I'm the one they're calling coerced," Serena said. "I'm the one they're calling witless and frightened and taken advantage of. If I stand in that square and speak for myself," she felt the thing she was building take its final shape in her mind, "then no one who was there can say afterward that I didn't choose this." Kyle was quiet for a moment. "Give me an hour," he said. "You have 30 minutes, she said. "If Garrick's steward is still sending messages, every minute we wait is another message." He looked at her with those amber eyes, and she had the odd sensation, a warmth that was not quite the bond, something more voluntary than that, of being genuinely, completely seen. 20 minutes, he said. Matt. The village square of Asheville was a packed dirt rectangle bordered on 3 sides by the cooper, the grain merchant, and the smithy, Rowan's father's smithy, which was a detail the morning seemed determined to refuse her the grace of not noticing. The central well stood at the square's heart. Around it, by the time Serena and Kyle's party arrived, perhaps 60 people had gathered, some drawn by rumor, some by the unusual sight of 12 riders and the quality of gear that Kyle's men wore, some who had been there since Rowan started talking and had simply not left. Rowan was still there. He saw her immediately. She saw the exact moment he saw her, the shift in his posture, the too quick recalibration of his expression from comfortable public authority to something that was trying very hard to be casual and was not succeeding. He was standing near the well with 2 men she recognized as the voices from the alley, the rough older one and the younger nervous one, and all 3 of them went slightly still in the way of people who have been gambling and just heard the door open. Serena stopped in the center of the square. The crowd's attention settled on her with a palpable shift, the way sound changes when a room recognizes something important entering it. She did not look at Kyle. She looked at the crowd. "My name is Serena Vale," she said. Her voice carried. She had spent enough years in this village that most faces here knew her, and she used the familiarity of that recognition without leaning on it. "I know there have been stories in circulation this morning about what happened last night. I'm going to tell you what actually happened, and I am going to need you to listen to all of it before you decide what you think." Rowan moved. She caught it in her peripheral vision, a slight shift of his weight, the beginning of an interruption. "Rowan Ashby," she said, not raising her voice, not turning her head. "If you speak before I'm finished, I will have you bound and I will finish speaking while you're on the ground, and the second option will be considerably less dignified than the first." The square went very quiet. She heard, from somewhere behind her left shoulder, what was unmistakably the quietest possible version of Kyle, making a sound of barely restrained amusement that he had not quite managed to fully contain. She ignored it. She turned to face the crowd fully, and she spoke. She told them about the tunnel, about the satchel, about 8 months of carefully tended trust that had been built specifically to be spent. She told them what she had heard in the alley in Rowan's own words, the exact phrasing. "She'll be fine, eventually, probably." And she watched those words land in the faces of the people who had known Rowan Ashby since he was a child and had been listening to him this morning tell them she was the one who needed to be worried about. She told them about the logging road, the planned abandonment. She told them what that would have meant. A woman alone in the northern wilderness in the dark, in winter, 6 miles from the nearest farmstead, stripped of every coin and jewel she owned. She did not tell it dramatically. She did not perform it. She told it plainly, the way you tell something true, and the plainness was its own kind of devastating. When she finished, there was a silence. Then, from the back of the crowd, a woman's voice. "Rowan, is that true?" All eyes moved to him. He had the face of a man whose architecture has collapsed and who is trying to decide in real time whether to keep standing in the rubble or start walking. His jaw worked. His eyes moved from Serena to the crowd to his 2 companions, who had both, she noticed, taken a half step back, the instinctive distancing of men who are deciding which side of this to be on. "She's confused," he said finally. "She was frightened. She doesn't sound confused," said a man near the well. "She sounds like she's naming exactly what you were going to do," said the older woman beside him. And the atmosphere of the square, which had spent the morning being shaped by Rowan's version of events, shifted. Not dramatically, not all at once, but with the slow, irreversible weight of a tide coming in. The faces that had been uncertain became certain. The faces that had been sympathetic to Rowan became something else. Serena turned to Kael. He was already looking at her. The amber of his eyes in the cold morning light was something she was going to need a new word for, she thought. Not warmth exactly, not approval. Something that was both of those things and more settled than either. "The charges," she said quietly. He nodded, stepped forward, and in the voice of a man who needed no amplification, no elevation, no artifice of any kind, just the simple, bottomless gravity of a king who had decided a thing. Cale Ironclaw named Rowan Ashby in front of 60 witnesses in the square of Ashvale Village and laid the formal charges before the crowd like a verdict delivered by the ground itself. Rowan's face went the color of old ash. Serena stood in the pale winter sunlight, the bond warm at her throat, 60 people around her, and felt the thing she had been building all night, the fragile, furious, terrifying thing, hold. For now. She knew, even as the charges landed and Rowan stood silent and stripped and exposed in the morning light, that this was not finished. Her father was still in the keep calculating. Garrick's steward had been sending messages since dawn, and the political machinery that had been building toward her marriage for months did not dismantle itself because a woman stood in a village square and told the truth. But something had changed. The ground beneath her feet was different than it had been last night. She was still standing on it. That was enough. For now, that was enough. That was enough. For now, that was enough. But the morning was not done with her. She had turned from the square and taken perhaps 10 steps back toward the keep when she heard the horses. Not Kael's horses. She had already learned the particular sound of those animals, the deep, even rhythm of exceptional breeding. These were different. More of them. Coming from the south road at a pace that was not quite urgent but was emphatically not casual, and the sound of them was multiplying the way bad news multiplies, each hoofbeat adding to the last until the noise of it filled the cold air of the village like weather arriving. Kael heard it at the same moment she did. She knew because she felt it, not through any mystical property of the bond, but through the way his body changed beside her, the slight shift of his weight onto the forward foot, the quality of his attention sharpening into something that was more animal than human and considerably more dangerous than either. "How many?" she said. 20, he said quietly. "Maybe more." She turned. They came around the bend in the south road in a column that resolved, as it drew closer, into something larger and more organized than a simple riding party. 30 men, possibly 35, all bearing Garrick's colors, the dark blue and iron gray of the house that had always seemed to Serena, even in her childhood, to be colors chosen by someone who wanted to make other people feel cold. At the column's head, on a black horse that was broad and heavy and built for presence rather than speed, rode a man she recognized. Lord Garrick. She had not been told he was coming in person. She had not been told he was anywhere within 3 days' ride. The message to Steward Holt this morning the contract is under review, pending examination, had been written in the careful, measured language of men who are buying time. Lord Garrick had apparently decided that he did not need time. He had decided to buy territory instead. He was larger than she remembered, or perhaps it was the horse, or the column behind him, or the particular optical effect of seeing someone you had hoped to never see again approaching you directly across open ground. He was broad through the chest and thick through the neck. The silver hair she remembered now cut close to his skull, and the pewter eyes, she had remembered those correctly, were already moving across the scene in front of him with a practiced efficiency that reminded her, uncomfortably, of her father. The same calculation, the same inventory. His eyes found Serena. They moved to the mark on her throat. Something moved in them that she could not precisely identify. It was not anger exactly, though there was anger somewhere in the vicinity. It was the particular expression of a man who has been planning a thing for a long time and has just discovered that someone has moved the object of his plan without asking permission. He pulled the black horse to a stop 20 feet from where she stood. "Lord Vale's daughter," he said. His voice was deep, unhurried, the voice of a man accustomed to speaking in rooms that go quiet when he enters. He did not look at Kael. He looked at Serena. "You've created a considerable problem." "Lord Garrick," she said. Her voice came out level. She was proud of that. "Your travel was quick." "I was already on the road," he said. "When Holt's message arrived, I was 6 hours south. I have been 6 hours south since yesterday because—" He paused with the precision of someone deploying a specific piece of information. "I was aware that you might attempt something exactly like this." The village square had not emptied. The 60 people who had been standing there through the charges against Rowan were still present, drawn by the new arrival, rearranged by the column of soldiers into a tighter cluster near the well. Serena could feel their attention, not hostile toward her now, not after the square, but not with her either. Watching. The way people watch a fire to see which direction it spreads before they decide how far back to stand. "You were told," she said carefully, "that the contract has a prior claim against it, under territorial law." "Under territorial law," Garrick said, and now there was something in his voice that was heavier than before. "A prior claim must be registered with the Joint Territorial Council before it supersedes a noble contract. It cannot simply be declared in a village square." He looked at her with those pewter eyes. "Which means your contract with me remains active until the council reviews the claim documentation, which will take—" Another precise pause. "A minimum of 6 weeks." Serena did not let her face move. 6 weeks. He had come here specifically to name that number, specifically to tell her that the gap between last night and legal permanence was 6 weeks wide, and in 6 weeks a great many things could happen to a young woman in a territory where her father had already signed one contract on her behalf. 6 weeks, she said. "In the interim," Garrick continued, "you are legally still under your father's authority, and under the terms of the contract I signed with him, which means," he let the weight of it land, "you will come with me now." The square was very quiet. She felt Kael beside her, not moving, not yet. But the 12 men of his party had repositioned themselves. She could not see it, but she could feel it in the geometry of the air, the way the space around Garrick's column had subtly reorganized. And the quality of the stillness among them was a specific kind of stillness, the kind that precedes something. "I'm not going anywhere with you," Serena said. "You don't have a choice," Garrick said. He said it with the absolute patience of a man who has said such things many times and has always, eventually, been right. "Legally, the 6-week registration requirement," Kael said, speaking for the first time since Garrick arrived, "applies to human noble contracts." He had not raised his voice. He did not need to. His voice in the cold air of the square had a carrying quality that was less about volume and more about weight. It does not apply to claiming bonds under Pact sovereignty, which operate under a separate legal framework entirely, one that does not recognize joint council jurisdiction. He paused. A claiming bond is not a contract. It is not a document. It is not a filing. It is a physical and legal reality that exists the moment it is made. There is nothing to register because there is nothing to review. It has already happened. Garrick's eyes moved to Kyle for the first time, and Serena watched. This was the moment she would return to, later, in the way you return to a door swinging open. She watched Lord Garrick look at Kyle the way he had been looking at her, with the practiced inventory of a man assessing an obstacle, and she watched the assessment complete itself, and she watched something shift in those pewter eyes that was not recalculation. It was recognition. Garrick knew who Kyle was. She was certain of it, in the same way she was certain of her own heartbeat. Garrick had not walked into this square blind. He had been on the road since yesterday, meaning his scouts had been ahead of him since earlier than that, meaning he had known, since well before dawn, that the man in the plain traveling cloak was not a village wanderer or a passing merchant or a minor pack noble with convenient authority. He had known who Kyle was, and he had come anyway, which meant the column of 35 men was not a show of force designed to intimidate a frightened girl. It was a calculated challenge to the king of the Ironclaw realm. The understanding moved through Serena's body like cold water finding the lowest ground, quietly, completely, in every direction at once. This was not a dispute about a marriage contract. This was something much larger than her. What happened next took approximately 90 seconds and rearranged the known world. Garrick made a small gesture with his left hand. Serena saw it from her peripheral vision. Compact, controlled, the gesture of a man signaling to people he trusts to interpret it correctly. From within his column, 3 riders separated. They did not draw weapons. They moved at a walk, casually, spreading out in a loose arc that happened, if you were tracking it geometrically, to be the exact positions you would take if you were trying to cut someone off from the tree line. Kyle did not react visibly. One of his men did. The man closest to Serena, dark-haired, mid-30s, a face she had not learned the name of yet, but whose bearing she had noted all morning as the one among the 12 who stayed closest without being instructed to, moved 1 step to her left, a single smooth step that placed him between her and the nearest of Garrick's repositioning riders. He did it without looking at her and without looking at Garrick. He did it the way a stone becomes a wall, by simply being there. "I would like," Garrick said, in the careful, heavy voice, "to speak with Lord Vale, directly, without intermediaries." "Lord Vale," Serena said, "is in the keep." "Then perhaps we should all go to the keep," Garrick said. She looked at Kyle. He was already looking at her. In his amber eyes was something she was learning to read. Not a command, not a suggestion, but an open question put directly to her. "What do you want to do?" She made her decision in approximately 3 seconds. She turned to face Garrick fully. "My father," she said, "will see you, alone, without your soldiers." She kept her gaze steady on his. 12 riders can water their horses at the village well. The rest will stay on the road. If you can't agree to that, then this conversation is already finished, because I will not walk into my father's keep with 30 armed men at my back and call it a courtesy visit. Around the square, 60 people were very still. Garrick looked at her for a long moment with those pewter eyes. She had the unpleasant sensation of being examined by something very old and very patient. He was reading her, taking her measure, deciding whether the 19-year-old in front of him, marked, defiant, clearly not the passive pawn his scouts had described, was a variable he had planned for. Then he smiled. It was a terrible smile. Not cruel, exactly. Worse than cruel. It was the smile of a man who is confident in his assessment and has decided that he is amused by what he has assessed. "You're more interesting than I expected," he said. "Most people are," Serena said, "if you actually bother to look at them." The smile faded. He dismounted. The great hall felt smaller than it had that morning. Same fire, same bare table, same torches guttering in the iron brackets. But the air in it had changed the way air changes when the weather outside is building towards something. Lord Aldrich had been summoned from his study and stood at the head of the table looking at Lord Garrick with an expression that was performing composure considerably harder than composure itself would require. Garrick had brought 2 men inside with him. Kale had matched this. His dark-haired man near the door, and one other, older, heavy-set, with the quiet authority of someone who handles legal matters. A scribe, perhaps, or a counselor. He had appeared from somewhere in Kyle's party without being formally introduced. Serena stood at the table's side. She had positioned herself deliberately between her father and Kyle, not as a buffer, but as a participant. She was done being positioned at the margins of conversations about her own life. Garrick placed his palms flat on the table and looked at Lord Aldrich. "Aldrich," he said, without preamble, "I want to be direct with you." "Please," said Lord Aldrich. "The contract holds," Garrick said. "I don't care about the claiming bond. I don't care about pack law or joint counsel timelines. I care about a signed agreement that I structured my house's financial arrangements around, and which your daughter has attempted to void through a midnight stunt with a stranger." He looked at Lord Aldrich steadily. "I am prepared to be reasonable. The bond documentation goes to the council, as it is legally required to, and during the review period, Serena comes with me. As a guest," he added, "not as a prisoner. She will be treated with full courtesy." "As a guest," Serena said, "in a house with 2 dead wives." Garrick turned those pewter eyes to her. "My first wife died of fever. My second wife is alive in a convent of her own choosing." "Of her own choosing," Serena repeated. "I don't expect you to take my word for that," Garrick said, still in that heavy, patient voice. "I expect you to be reasonable." He looked back to Lord Aldrich. "A 6-week review period, after which, if the council upholds the bond, and I will abide by that ruling, the contract is void. I walk away. No penalties claimed." Serena looked at her father. She could see him considering it. She could see the appeal of it for a man who thought in terms of damage, minimization, and forward position. A 6-week pause, a legal review, an orderly resolution, everything her father preferred in all circumstances. "The council," Kyle said from his side of the table, "is currently composed of 4 human lords, 2 of whom hold financial obligations to Garrick's house, and 1 pack representative who has been in dispute with Ironclaw territory for the past 18 months. He said this with the simple factual delivery of a man reading figures from a ledger. A council with those compositions does not review claiming bond documentation. It delays it for considerably longer than 6 weeks. His amber eyes went to Garrick. "You know this." A small pause. "You chose this specific council avenue," Kyle continued, "because you know its composition produces a favorable timeline for your position." He was quiet for a moment. "Which tells me this was never about a legal process. You're buying time to apply pressure elsewhere." The fire popped loudly in the hearth. Garrick's face had done nothing visible through this. He was very good, Serena thought. Better than her father at concealment. He had not moved, had not shifted, had not reacted, and the absence of reaction was its own kind of information. "What pressure?" Serena said, because she could feel the shape of it without yet seeing its full outline. Garrick looked at her. He looked at her for a long moment with those terrible pewter eyes, and she felt, for the first time since last night, the first time since the alley and the tunnel and the village square, something that was not strategic calculation, but was much older and more physical. Something that moved through her nervous system like a current. The thing that makes animals in open fields look up. Danger. Simple, direct, physical danger. "Lord Vale," Garrick said, not breaking his gaze from Serena. "How old were you when the Vale Estate's northern mining contracts were purchased by your family?" Lord Aldrich went very still. "Because the documentation on those contracts," Garrick continued, finally looking away from Serena and toward her father, "is interesting. The original land grants, the survey records from 3 generations back." He was quiet for a moment. "I've had researchers working on this for approximately 2 years. Do you know what they found?" Lord Aldrich said nothing. His face had gone a careful gray. "The northern boundary survey of the original Vale land grant was conducted in the 7th year of the Second Territorial Compact," Garrick said, "by a surveyor who was simultaneously employed by your grandfather's personal estate, which creates a conflict of interest that, under current territorial law, voids the validity of the original survey." He paused. "Which means the mining contracts derived from that survey are built on contested ground, which means approximately 40% of Vale estate income for the past 3 generations." Another pause, deliberate as footsteps. "May be legally challengeable." The room was very silent. Serena looked at her father. His face was performing composure with the effort of a man lifting something very heavy. "This is Lord Aldrich said very quietly. A 20-year-old administrative question. It is, Garrick agreed. The kind that can be resolved very quietly, between old allies, without ever touching a court. He looked at Lord Aldrich steadily. Or the kind that can become a very public, very extended legal proceeding that would tie up the Vale Estate's operational finances for the duration of the challenge. He spread his hands. I have no desire for that. I have only ever had one desire in this matter, which is the arrangement we agreed upon. The fire settled, the torches moved. Lord Aldrich turned to look at Serena, and she saw it happen. She watched it happen in real time, across the table, across the architecture of the morning. She watched her father look at her, and she watched him calculate, and she watched the balance tip, slowly, toward the side of the scale that contained everything he had built and everything he stood to lose. The mines, the contracts, the 40 years of careful accumulation. She was 19 years old. She was one person. Against 40% of the estate's income in a legal proceeding that could last a decade. Father, she said. Serena. His voice was the one she had grown up with. Not unkind, genuinely, not unkind. Don't, she said. You don't understand the scope. I understand exactly the scope, she said. Her voice was very even. I read your financial records. I know what the mining contracts are worth. I know what you stand to lose. She held his gaze. And I'm asking you anyway. Serena. Her name in his mouth again, something in it that was almost an apology. There are limits to what I can... Look at me, she said. He looked at her. I am your daughter, she said. Not your asset, not a political instrument, not a term in a contract. She felt something happening in her chest. Not breaking, because she had already broken once this week, and she did not have the time to break again. Something harder than breaking. Something that forms in the space where breaking used to be. Look at me and tell me, is there a version of this where I matter more than the mines? The hall was so quiet she could hear the wood settling in the hearth, the breath of the men at the doors. Lord Aldrich Vale looked at his daughter across the table. His sharp face and his sharp eyes and the 40 years of careful, relentless, survival-driven calculation. All of it was present in his face. And beneath all of it, barely visible, like something seen through deep water, was the man who had held her when she was 3 years old, and her mother was sick, and the whole world had felt too large and had said, I've got you, my darling, I've got you. She had not thought about that in a very long time. She thought about it now, looking at his face across the bare table. He looked away from her, the way he had looked away that morning in the keep, first time in 4 years. He looked down at the table and he pressed one hand flat against the wood, and he made a sound that was very quiet and not quite a word. No, he said. Everyone waited. No, he said again, and this time it had a direction to it. He looked up. He looked at Garrick. There is not a version of this where my daughter matters less than a property line. His voice was very careful and very steady. Take your researchers' findings and take your riders and leave my land, Garrick. The contract is void. The claim is valid. I won't be signing anything else on my daughter's behalf. Garrick looked at Lord Aldrich for a long moment. The amused expression was gone. What replaced it was something much more direct. The stripped-back face of a man who is done with the performance phase of a negotiation and has moved into something else. You'll regret this, Garrick said. He said it without drama, without rage, with the flat certainty of a man describing weather. I want you to know that I mean that without malice, Aldrich. I simply mean it as a fact. I've regretted many things, Lord Aldrich said. I find I'm adding fewer of them every year. Garrick straightened. He looked at Serena one last time. Those pewter eyes moved from her face to the mark at her throat, and in them she saw something she had not expected. Not the anger she had braced for, not the calculation she had learned to read, but something older. Something that looked for just a moment like the specific sadness of a man who understands that he has lost. Then it was gone, packed away behind those pewter eyes, and he nodded once, a small, precise nod, and turned and walked out of the great hall. The doors closed. The afternoon that followed had the strange, suspended quality of the hour after a storm. Everything in it slightly too bright, slightly too quiet. The ground changed in ways that wouldn't fully reveal themselves until you started walking on it. Garrick's column was gone from the village road by midday. His men pulled out with the organized efficiency of a force that had been planning its movements regardless of outcome, and watching them go from the keep's upper window, Serena felt a relief that was immediately complicated by the knowledge that gone and finished were not the same word. Kael found her at the window. "He'll challenge the mining contracts," she said. "Yes," Kael said. "He'll wait until we've left the territory, and my father is managing it alone." She did not take her eyes off the road. "He's patient. He'll pick the right moment." "Yes," Kael said again. He stood beside her and looked at the same road. "Your father knew this when he said what he said." She absorbed that. "I know." "Does it change anything for you?" Kael asked. Not how do you feel, so that was not the question. The question was precise and genuinely curious, and she had begun to understand across the 12 hours of knowing him that all of his questions were genuinely curious. He asked things because he wanted to know the actual answer, not because he was navigating toward a predetermined response. "It changes my understanding of what it cost him," she said. "It doesn't change what he did before." "The 19 years." She paused. "I'll carry both things. I think that's what you do with complicated people." Kael was quiet for a moment. "Yes," he said simply. She turned from the window. "The documentation," she said. "How long before it's complete?" "My counselor has been working since we arrived, 2 hours perhaps." "And after the documentation, we ride for Ironclaw." She nodded. She had known this was coming, had been carrying the knowledge of it since the clearing last night, but hearing it said plainly in the afternoon light of her father's keep made it real in a new way. Ironclaw. The wild northern kingdom beyond the mountain passes, the place she had read about in history books at age 12 with the breathless curiosity of a child who suspects that reality has better rooms than the one she's been given access to. She was going to live there. She was going to be its queen. She stood in the upper gallery with the winter light flat and white through the long windows and tried to locate the fear of that. She looked for it with the careful interior attention of someone checking a familiar room for an object they've lost. It was not there. What was there was something she did not have a clean word for, a kind of vertigo that was not unpleasant, the feeling of standing at the edge of something vast and finding that the vastness is not hostile. She thought about her mother's hands, the pearl choker. "Be clever, my darling. Whatever else they take, keep that." She had kept it. She had kept it through the tunnel and the alley and the village square and the great hall and Lord Garrick's terrible pewter eyes and her father's hand pressed flat against the table. She had kept it intact, and she was still standing with it, and she was going to carry it north into the wild kingdom, and she was going to be clever there too, in all the ways she hadn't been given room to be clever here. She turned away from the window. "I need an hour," she said. "There's something I need to do before we leave." Kael looked at her. He did not ask what it was. She was beginning to understand that this, the not asking, the space he left for her to be a complete person with private purposes, was something he did deliberately. "An hour," he said. She found her father in his study. He was sitting at his desk, not working, which was unusual. He was simply sitting there in the afternoon light with his hands folded in front of him and the expression of a man engaged in very private arithmetic. He looked up when she entered, and something moved through his face quickly, the layered complexity she had been learning to read all day. She had come with a specific purpose, and she had decided on the walk up the stairs to accomplish that purpose before she let herself feel anything about it, because if she felt it first, she would lose the thread. "The legal renunciation," she said. She stood in the doorway. "I need you to sign it." He looked at her. "Serena, I know what it means," she said. "It means you permanently relinquish legal guardianship. It means you can't enter into any future contracts on my behalf. It means that if Garrick brings a challenge later and tries to argue that you retain authority over my legal standing," she kept her voice even, "there is nothing to argue from. I am legally and completely my own person." Lord Aldrich looked at his hands for a moment. "You don't trust that what I did this morning was enough," he said. It was not an accusation. "I trust that you meant what you said this morning," she said. "I trust that you meant it in the moment. I also know that moments are not contracts, and contracts are not character, and that you have a talent for recalculating towards survival when the pressure is high enough. She held his gaze. I need a piece of paper that means the recalculation is off the table. Not because I think you're a bad man, Father, because I need to know I'm safe. Permanently. For the first time. Lord Aldrich was quiet for a long time. Outside the study window, the sky had gone the pale, depthless gray of a northern winter afternoon, and in the silence she could hear the distant sound of horses in the courtyard, Kael's men preparing for departure. Her father opened his desk drawer. He withdrew a sheet of vellum and the formal seal. He uncapped his ink. He wrote with the quick, precise strokes of a man who has made decisions before and knows that hesitation in the execution helps nothing. He pressed the seal. He held it out to her. She crossed the room. She took the document from his hands. She held it and looked at it. The words, the date, the seal, the signature. And she felt the thing she had been putting off feeling arrive at last. Not relief quite. Something more complicated than relief. The specific weight of a thing ending that was bad and a thing ending that was not entirely bad, and the difficulty of distinguishing between the two when they are the same thing and the same ending. I'm sorry, Lord Aldrich said quietly. For all of it. For the years of it. He looked at his hands. I told myself I was keeping you safe. I believe that. I know, Serena said. That doesn't fix it. No, she agreed. It doesn't. She folded the renunciation carefully and placed it inside her coat, against her ribs beside where the coin purse had been last night. A different kind of wealth now, the kind that took 19 years to earn and could not be stolen. She looked at her father for a moment, a man who had made her and failed her and stood up for her in the same morning and would spend a long time living with the complicated arithmetic of all three. Take care of the Western timber contracts, she said, and hire a better surveyor before Garrick's researchers file anything. Something moved across his face, almost a smile. The law library, he said. Third shelf, she said. North wall. She walked out. The courtyard was alive with preparation when she came down the main stair, horses being saddled, packs being adjusted and checked with the economical efficiency of men who traveled constantly and had reduced the mechanics of departure to something close to art. The afternoon light was already thinning toward the early dark of a northern winter, the sky going from gray to the deeper gray that preceded dusk. She crossed to where her horse was being held by one of Kael's men, the dark-haired one who had stepped between her and Garrick's rider in the square. She had still not learned his name. She realized, mounting up, that she was going to be spending the foreseeable future learning the names and natures of 12 people she had known for less than a day. She found that she did not mind this. In fact, she found that the prospect of it, the whole uncharted territory of a life she had not been given and had not been promised and had taken anyway, by walking out of a tunnel and through a grate and into a cold night and straight into a stranger with amber eyes, sat inside her like the first warmth of a fire catching. Kael came out of the main keep entrance at the same moment she settled in the saddle. He had changed from the traveling cloak into a riding coat she had not seen before, darker, heavier, with the iron claw mark at the collar in black thread. He looked different in it, not different in kind, but different in degree, like something that had been traveling incognito had stopped bothering. He swung up onto his horse with the easy familiarity of someone who has spent more of their life on horseback than off it, and he looked at her across the courtyard with those amber eyes. Ready, she said. Your father, he said. Not a question. Managed, she said. Something in his expression, a quiet acknowledgement that didn't require words and didn't ask for elaboration. He nodded once. The gates of Asheville Keep opened. They rode out into the late afternoon, 12 riders and a king and a woman with a legal renunciation against her ribs and a claiming bond warm at her throat and the whole wild northern world ahead of her. She did not look back. She had stopped looking back. They were 3 miles out of the village, moving north on the pine road in the gathering dark, when the first arrow came out of the trees. It missed Kael by 4 inches. She heard it, the distinctive splitting sound of an arrow moving fast through cold air, and then the thud of it driving into the road surface 3 feet ahead of his horse, and then the horse shying hard to the right, and then the world compressed into the single, clarifying instant of understanding. They had been waiting. Garrick's men had not all left. They had not all left because they were never meant to leave. The column on the road had been a performance. The 35 visible riders pulling out in organized order had been designed to be watched, counted, confirmed, while the ones who were meant to matter slipped into the tree line before the column formed up, before dawn, before anyone was counting in that direction. "Riders!" one of Kael's men shouted, the dark-haired one, already turning his horse, already moving to position. They came out of the trees on both sides of the road simultaneously. Not 30, not even 20. 8. 8 men in Garrick's colors, moving fast and low, with the purposeful economy of men who had a specific objective and had been given a specific amount of time to accomplish it. The objective was not Kael. She understood this in the first 3 seconds, because not one of the 8 was moving toward him. They were all moving toward her. Serena pulled her horse hard left, away from the nearest rider, feeling the animal respond. Good horse, excellent horse, responsive and fast. And she had a single crystalline moment of calculation. Tree line. She could reach the tree line. If she could reach the tree line in the dark, they would have to follow individually, and Kael's men were already engaging the riders on the road. She had perhaps 40 seconds. She drove her heels in and the horse surged. She heard Kael shout her name. One word. Her name in a voice that was not the controlled, unhurried voice of the morning and the afternoon. A voice stripped of everything except the raw, unguarded thing underneath, the voice of a man who has had something taken from him and is not going to allow it. She was 15 feet from the tree line. She was 10. The second rider came from her left. She hadn't seen him because he hadn't come from the trees. He had come from the road ditch, low and fast on foot, and he wasn't going for her horse. He grabbed her. The impact pulled her half out of the saddle. Her horse screamed and spun. She kept her grip on the reins by instinct and felt her shoulder wrench as her weight swung outward, and the man's grip on her coat pulled the other way, and the satchel, still across her body, the document inside it, the bond documentation not yet complete, in Kael's counselor's bag on a horse 20 feet behind her. All of it was irrelevant in the specific total reality of hanging half off a terrified horse above the frozen ground, with a man's hand in her collar, and the tree line 3 feet away in the dark. She let go of the reins. She grabbed the man's wrist with both hands, and she dropped. The fall was not graceful. She hit the ground on her side and rolled, pulling the man's grip loose, and the frozen road came up hard against her hip and shoulder, and the world went briefly bright at the edges. The horse bolted. She rolled once more and got her knees under her and came up into a crouch with the cold air in her lungs, and the man lunging toward her again in the dark of the trees 2 feet behind her. She ran. She was 3 steps into the tree line when she heard the sound, close, very close, and moving fast. And she knew, without seeing it, that it was not one of the 8. It was something else, something much larger, something that moved through the dark between the trees the way very few things move, without hesitation, without sound, with the absolute confidence of a predator in its own territory. She stopped. The man behind her did not stop. He crashed into the tree line 2 steps behind her, and then he stopped, very abruptly, in the way that things stop when they encounter something in the dark that removes all forward momentum. In the darkness between the pine trees, amber eyes opened. They were low to the ground, and then they were not. They rose as the shape attached to them rose, and the shape was not a man's shape. It was larger, much larger, and the sound it made was not a human sound in any register, low and resonant and old in the way that winter and stone and deep water are old. Serena stood in the dark with her back against a pine trunk and her heart in her throat. The man behind her made a sound she would not remember precisely, but would not entirely forget, and then she heard him running, back toward the road, back through the brush, crashing and graceless with panic. The amber eyes looked at her. She looked back. She was not afraid. She would examine this fact later, in daylight, with adequate rest, in the ordered calm of reflection, and she would find it genuinely interesting that standing in the dark woods with a massive alpha in full shift 10 feet away, she was not afraid. The bond was warm at her throat. The air around her was very still. She thought, this is what permanent means. The amber eyes blinked once, slowly, in the dark. Then the sounds from the road changed, the engagement, the horses, the sharp exchange of 12 men who were very good at their work. And the amber eyes moved past her toward the road, and she pressed herself against the pine tree and breathed, and she did not look away. She was still standing in the exact same spot, with the dark around her and the amber eyes burning through it, when the sounds from the road went quiet. She was still standing in the exact same spot, with the dark around her and the amber eyes burning through it, when the sounds from the road went quiet. The silence that replaced the fight was the specific silence of things concluded. Not the silence of absence, but the silence of completion. The sound a room makes when every voice in it has said what it came to say. She knew it even from inside the tree line, even without seeing the road, even with nothing to go on except the quality of the air and the absence of the particular sounds that had been filling it for the past several minutes. The horses, the impact, the controlled, economical exchange of men who were serious about their work. The amber eyes blinked once more, looking at her. Then they moved. The shape that carried them moved through the dark with a fluid, unhurried grace that was nothing like the way men moved in the dark. No branch catching, no snow crunching, no evidence of mass displacing space. It was simply present, and then it was elsewhere, and the cold air between the trees settled back to stillness as though it had never been disturbed. Serena breathed. She pressed herself off the pine trunk and moved toward the road. The scene she emerged into was organized. That was the first thing she registered. Not the aftermath of chaos, but the aftermath of controlled engagement. The 12 men of Kael's party having distributed themselves across the road with the practiced precision of people who had done this kind of work before and had a system for the morning after. 6 of Garrick's ambush riders were on the ground, not moving in the way of men who had been hit very hard and had stopped making decisions. 2 more were sitting against the road's edge with their hands visible, being observed by one of Kael's men with the patient attention of a man who expects them to stay sitting and is confident in this expectation. Her horse had stopped 30 feet up the road and was standing with its reins trailing, blowing hard but unharmed. Kael was at the road's center. He was back to his human shape. She had not seen the transition. She had only seen the amber eyes in the dark and the shape that carried them. And now here he was, plain traveling cloak, dark riding coat, the same unhurried, self-contained presence he had had at the tavern door last night. Except that something was different. The controlled quality was still there, the economy of presence, but beneath it, like a fire banked down to coals, was a heat she could feel from 12 feet away. He was looking at the road, at the scene, at the 8 men, and doing the accounting. He looked up when she emerged from the tree line. She had 2 seconds to see what happened in his face before he put it away. It was more than she had seen there before, more than the amber amusement, more than the steady respect, more than the quarter smiles. Something raw and unguarded that moved through his expression like light through water and then settled back below the surface. He crossed to her in 4 strides. "Are you hurt?" he said. Not "are you all right?" The specific, practical question. His hands moved to her shoulders, not gripping, just present, checking. "My hip," she said. "From the fall. It'll bruise." She met his eyes. "I'm not hurt." He looked at her for a moment. Something moved in those amber eyes. "You let go of the reins," he said. "I needed both hands." "You dropped on purpose." "The alternative was being dragged," she said. "Dropping was better." He looked at her for another moment with that quality of recalibrating an already high estimate. "Yes," he said. "It was." He stepped back. The practical king resumed. He turned to the road and began issuing quiet instructions. And she watched his men move with the efficiency of people who had been given a task by someone they trusted completely, and she stood on the cold, frozen road in the dark and felt the bruise forming along her hip and the bond warm at her throat, and something else, something that had been building since the clearing last night, and the village square this morning, and the great hall this afternoon, and the tree line just now. Something that felt, she thought, a great deal like the specific gravity of a home you have not been in before, but recognize immediately when you enter it. She went and collected her horse. They made camp 4 miles north of Ashvale, in a clearing off the pine road where the trees provided shelter on 3 sides, and a frozen creek ran along the fourth edge with the low, patient sound of water moving under ice. Kael's men built a fire with the same systematic efficiency that characterized everything they did. Quickly, without discussion, each person apparently knowing their part without being told, and within 20 minutes there was warmth, there was light, and the two surviving members of the ambush party were sitting bound at the camp's edge being watched by the dark-haired man whose name she had still not learned. She made a decision about that. She crossed to him where he stood, hands loose at his sides, eyes on the prisoners. "I don't know your name," she said. He looked at her with the careful, measuring attention she had noticed all day. Not hostile, but thorough. The look of a man who forms opinions slowly and keeps them until they change. "Davin," he said. "Davan," she repeated. "You've been closest to me all day. That was deliberate." "Yes," he said. "Whose instruction?" He looked at her steadily. "The king's." She absorbed this. "Since when?" "Since the village," Davan said. "When you spoke in the square." He paused, and she had the impression of a man deciding whether to add something and then deciding to. "Before that, if I'm honest, since he came back from the clearing last night." She looked at him for a moment. "Thank you," she said, "for the step you took in the square." Davan looked at her with those careful eyes and nodded once, not dismissively, not cursorily, the nod of a man accepting a genuine thing genuinely offered. She went back to the fire. The interrogation, if it could be called that, it was more precise than the word usually implies, happened at the fire's edge while the camp settled around them into the organized stillness of people who know how to rest efficiently in the field. Kael conducted it. She sat 3 feet away and listened and did not try to make herself invisible, because she had spent enough time being invisible in rooms where decisions were made about her, and she was not going to do it again. The two men from the ambush were not hardened. That was the first thing. They were Garrick's household soldiers, mid-rank, the kind of men who carried out instructions because instructions were what they received, and following them was what kept them fed. They were frightened and cold, and they had just watched 6 of their companions put down by 12 men who moved with a precision and a force that was not entirely human, and they were prepared to talk with a thoroughness that made the conversation very short. Garrick had not left the territory. This was the first piece of information, and it reorganized everything that had happened since midday. The column on the road had been a performance exactly as she had suspected, but not in the direction she had assumed. She had thought he was demonstrating departure. He had actually been demonstrating options, showing them 35 men leaving by the front door while positioning his real move by the back. He was at a hunting lodge 7 miles east, a property belonging to a minor lord who held obligations to Garrick's financial network. He had been there since the morning, waiting for news of the ambush. Specifically, waiting for news that the claiming bond documentation had been taken. Because the documentation, while not legally required for the bond to exist, was the most concrete and portable form of evidence. Without it, the council process, corrupt composition, and all, would operate on testimony alone, which was slower and less definitive and easier to contest. The goal of the ambush had been the documentation satchel. And Serena. Because without her testimony and without her physical presence, a claiming bond could be contested on grounds of disappearance. Pack law was clear on it. A claimed mate, who could not be produced for confirmation within 30 days of the bond, was presumed to have contested it. Garrick was not trying to force a marriage anymore. He had moved to a simpler objective. Make her disappear long enough for the bond to become legally ambiguous. Take the documents. Deliver her somewhere he controlled. Wait 30 days. She sat at the fire's edge and she listened to all of this, and she kept her face very still. "The lodge," Kael said to the second soldier. "How many men?" 15, the man said. He was perhaps 30, a plain face, the look of someone who had made a series of choices that had led him here and was having second thoughts about the entire chain. "Plus Garrick and Holt." "Fortified?" "It's a hunting lodge, stone walls, 1 main entrance, a servant passage out the back. It's not built for this. He didn't expect—" The man stopped. "He didn't expect to be sitting in it answering for an ambush that failed," Kael finished, without inflection. He looked at the man steadily. "Is that what he didn't expect?" The soldier said nothing, which was its own answer. Kael stood. He looked at Serena across the fire. She was already looking at him. 7 miles east, she said. Yes, he said. Tonight, she said. He watched her for a moment. You want to come? I want to finish it, she said. She held his gaze. I want to stand in front of him, and I want to be the one he's answering to. Not your soldiers. Not a court proceeding 3 months from now. She paused. Me. Tonight. While he's still sitting in that lodge thinking he controls the timeline. The fire crackled between them. He has 15 men, Kael said. You have 12, she said, and whatever you are, in the dark. The amber in his eyes shifted, the warmth moving in them like firelight in whiskey. He did not make the quarter smile. He made something better than that. The full thing, brief and real, and then it was gone. Davan, he said, without looking away from her. Ready, Davan said from the camp's edge. We ride in 20 minutes, Kael said. 7 miles in the dark on good horses took less than an hour. They left the 2 prisoners under the watch of 2 of the 12, Kael's party reduced to 10, plus Serena, and moved east through the forest on a track that was less road than suggestion, the frozen ground hard and reliable under the horses' feet and the stars very bright above the pine canopy. Serena rode between Kael and Davan, and the cold was the kind that sharpens rather than dulls, the kind that takes everything unnecessary out of your thinking and leaves only the parts that are actually useful. She had, over the past 24 hours, discovered something about herself that she suspected she had always known, but had never been given the conditions to confirm. She was good in motion. She thought clearly when things were happening, the compressed, clarifying quality of genuine pressure, the kind that removes options until only the right one is left, suited her in a way that the slow, ambient pressure of her father's keep never had. She was thinking clearly now. Garrick's leverage, she said to Kael, riding close enough that her voice would carry without traveling beyond them. The mining contracts, the survey dispute. It doesn't disappear when we take him tonight, Kael said. He had known this was where her thinking was going. No, she said, but it changes character. Right now it's a threat he holds over my father in a context where my father is isolated. If Garrick is publicly discredited, she worked through it. If there's a public trial, if the ambush attempt is formally charged, if his methods are in the open, she paused, then the mining contract dispute isn't leverage anymore. It's a counter-allegation. Any judge reviewing the survey challenge will also be reviewing the history of a man who organized an armed ambush on a King's Claim mate on a public road. She looked at Kael. Those 2 things don't coexist cleanly in any court. Kael was quiet for a moment, riding. You want a public trial. I want everything that happened in that alley and on that road to be said out loud in a room full of people, Serena said. Not because I need the satisfaction of it, because the only thing that permanently removes Garrick's power over my father's estate is making the use of that power more expensive than the leverage is worth. She paused. He works in shadows, quiet pressure, administrative complications, things that happen in back rooms. She felt the shape of it solidify. A public trial is the one thing he can't use any of his tools against, because his tools are designed for private architecture. Kael rode beside her in the dark, and the silence had the quality she was beginning to associate with him specifically. Not empty, but full, the silence of a person processing thoroughly. There's a problem with a public trial, he said. The council composition, she said. Yes, Garrick's men on the council will move to have it heard in closed proceedings. The moment it goes closed, the public dimension disappears, and we're back in the territory where he has advantages. Then it can't be a council trial, Serena said. What does that leave? She thought for a moment. The horses moved through the dark. Pine shadows crossed them and opened and crossed again. Pack law, she said. You said the claiming bond operates outside council jurisdiction. Does pack law extend to crimes committed against a claim mate on pack-adjacent territory? A pause. Yes, Kael said slowly. How public is a pack law proceeding? By tradition, he said, all proceedings under pack law are open, mandatory. Any member of the community, human or pack, Who wishes to witness may attend. He paused. It cannot be closed. The open character is a foundational provision. A closed pack law proceeding has no legal standing. She looked at him. He looked at her. You, he said, have been thinking about this since the lodge information. Since the fire, she agreed. The quarter smile materialized, and this time it went the full distance. Since the fire, he said. The hunting lodge of Veldcross was a stone building set in a shallow clearing at the edge of the eastern forest. 2 stories, no moat, a perimeter of split-rail fencing that was decorative rather than defensive. Torchlight in 3 of the lower windows. 2 men at the main entrance, stamping against the cold. The servant passage at the back, as described. A low door in the stone wall, unguarded, leading to the kitchen. Kael's men went in through the servant passage. It was not a long engagement. It was not precisely an engagement at all. It was closer to the specific contained experience of walking through a building and informing each room you enter that the nature of the evening has changed. By the time Serena and Kael came through the main entrance, the 2 door guards having been relocated to the ground without ceremony by Davan and a man named Kress, the lodge's interior had been efficiently reorganized. Garrick's 15 soldiers were in the main hall, sitting with the resigned posture of men who had run the numbers and arrived at correct conclusions. Holt was at the far end of the hall, standing against the wall with his thin, precise face, doing the specific expressions of a man who manages other people's crises and has suddenly found himself in the center of one. Garrick was at the table. He had been eating when they arrived. The meal was still there, bread, a joint of something, wine, and he had pushed back from it and was standing now, his hands on the table's edge, those pewter eyes moving across the room and assembling information. He looked at Serena. She walked to the center of the hall, in the torchlight, with the cold still on her from the ride, the bruise forming along her hip, and the bond warm at her throat, and the renunciation document inside her coat, and the claiming bond documentation in Kael's counselor's bag, and 7 miles of winter forest between her and the village where she had been a pawn this time yesterday. Serena Vale looked at the man who had spent 2 years arranging her future without asking her and said, "Sit down, Lord Garrick." He looked at her for a long moment. He sat down. It was, she would think later, one of the more interesting moments of the entire affair. Not because of what it contained dramatically, but because of what it revealed. Garrick sat because the room had reorganized around him, and his options had been removed. Yes, but there was also something in the way he did it. Not the collapse of a man whose bluster has failed, but the adjustment of a man who is paying attention, who has looked at the woman standing in the center of the room and revised his assessment significantly upward from the version he had been working from. "You came yourself," he said. Not impressed exactly. Something more neutral and more real. Noting. "Yes," she said. "I expected to be dealing with his men." "I know," she said. "That's why I came." A pause. "What do you want?" he said. "I want you to understand something," she said. She kept her voice level and clear, the way she had kept it in the village square, not performed, not theatrical, plain. Because plainness was its own kind of force when the thing being said plainly was true. "Everything you built to use against my father, the survey research, the contract dispute, the financial pressure, I'm not asking you to surrender it. I'm asking you to understand what it costs to use it." Garrick looked at her steadily. "You had men waiting on the road tonight," she said. "Armed men, with the objective of taking me by force. That is an act of violence against a king's claimed mate, under pack law, which you already know applies to this bond, because you read the same law books my father has in his library, and you have had 2 years to prepare. That is not a civil dispute. It is a criminal act. Specifically, it falls under the provision against interference with a sovereign claiming bond by force or deception." She paused. "Which means it goes to a pack law proceeding, which is mandatory and open and cannot be closed by council maneuvering." She held his gaze. "Every person in this territory who wants to attend, and after this morning's square, I believe that number will be significant, will be there to hear every detail of what happened on the road tonight and what was planned before it." Garrick was very still. "And once those details are public," she continued, Every financial and legal instrument you have been quietly positioning over the past 2 years, every obligation, every threat, every administrative lever, they all become visible in the same light, not as careful political maneuvering, as context. She paused. The context of what kind of man built them. The hall was absolutely silent. Holt at the wall had stopped doing anything with his face at all. He was simply standing, listening, with the expression of a man watching a structure he helped build begin to shift. "You're offering me something," Garrick said. He was reading her again, those pewter eyes, careful and thorough. "You didn't come here to lecture me. I came to give you a choice," she said, "which is more than you gave me." She felt the steadiness in herself, the same steadiness that had been there in the tunnel, and the square, and the great hall, and the tree line, and every moment of this long, cold, compressing night. "You withdraw the survey challenge. You release every outstanding obligation my father owes your house. You remove your men from this territory by morning." She paused. "In exchange, the ambush tonight is documented, but not publicly prosecuted. It becomes part of a sealed record that is filed, witnessed, and held." She looked at him. "A record that comes out if anything attempts to reach my father's estate or my person through any channel, legal or otherwise, in any form, at any point in the future." She let the silence hold. "You're describing a sword that stays sheathed as long as I stay quiet," Garrick said. "I'm describing an arrangement," she said, "where you keep what you've built and I keep what I've built, and neither of us has to spend the next decade in courtrooms." She held his gaze. "The difference between us is that I built mine in one night and you built yours in 2 years, and mine is worth more." Something moved across Garrick's face. She had expected anger, the controlled, weighted kind she had seen in the great hall. She had expected calculation. She had even, in some prepared corner of her thinking, expected contempt. What she had not expected was what actually moved through his expression, something that took her a moment to identify, because she had not anticipated seeing it on him. A kind of recognition. Not of her specifically, but of something he was looking at in her. The architecture of a particular kind of mind that had made a particular kind of decision under a particular kind of pressure, and had been right. "How old are you?" he said. 19, she said. He was quiet for a moment, then, "What happens if I refuse?" "The proceeding opens tomorrow," she said. "Pack law, open hall, everyone watching." She paused. "And I am a very good speaker when I have something true to say." He looked at her. He looked at Kyle, who had been standing at the room's edge with his arms loose at his sides, and his amber eyes on Garrick with the patient attention of a man who has already made up his mind and is giving the other party the courtesy of making up theirs. He looked back at Serena. "Holt," he said. "My lord," Holt said from the wall. "Draft the withdrawal documents tonight," Garrick said. "The survey challenge, the obligation records, all of it." He looked at the table, at the bread and the wine and the interrupted meal, and something in his posture settled. Not the settling of defeat, but the particular settling of a man releasing a weight he had been carrying for longer than was strictly necessary. "We leave at first light." The ride back was slower than the ride out. The urgency had drained from the night, and what was left was the cold and the dark and the stars and the quiet, even sound of horses on frozen ground. The lodge was 4 miles behind them, and the camp was 3 miles ahead, and the world between those 2 points was very still. Serena rode beside Kyle. "The sealed record," he said, not questioning it, examining it. "He'll honor it," she said, "not because he's trustworthy, because the alternative is worse than the cost, and he knows it." "Yes," Kyle said. "That's also what I thought." A pause. "The survey challenge would have damaged your father's estate significantly." "Yes," she said. "You traded a proceeding that would have punished Garrick publicly for a resolution that protects your father's income." She looked ahead at the dark road between the pines. "My father stood up for me this morning," she said, "in a room with Garrick's seal on the table and 40 years of his own construction at risk." She was quiet for a moment. "He stood up for me, and it cost him something real. The least I could do was make sure it didn't cost him everything. Kael rode beside her in the dark. "You are," he said carefully, "not what I expected when a woman walked into me outside a tavern last night." "What did you expect?" "Someone frightened," he said. "Someone who needed protecting." She considered this. "I did need protecting last night." "You needed a door," he said. "There's a difference. You walked through it yourself." She looked at him. In the starlight, his profile was sharp and clear, the amber of his eyes catching the light from above the canopy. "What were you doing at that tavern?" she said. "You were already in the territory, with 12 men and 6 horses." A pause. "That is a longer conversation," he said. "We have 3 miles," she said. He was quiet for a moment that stretched in a way that felt deliberate. Not evasion, but the care of a person organizing something they intend to say accurately. "I have been in this territory twice in the past year," he said. "Not in Asheville specifically. Moving through the Northern Passage, managing a boundary dispute between 2 pack families in the Highland Territory." He paused. "Both times I came through Asheville. Both times I stayed at the tavern one night." He looked at the road ahead. "The second time, 6 months ago, I saw you." She kept her eyes on the road. "In the market," he said. "You were arguing with a grain merchant about the weight calculation on a delivery to the keep. He was wrong. You knew he was wrong, and you knew exactly why, and you told him exactly why, with the patience of a person who has learned that being right is not the same as being heard." A pause. "He still shortchanged you. You walked away, and your face did something—" He paused. "Complicated. Like a person who is used to that outcome and is tired of being used to it." The pines moved around them in a slow wind. "I thought about that face for 6 months," he said simply. Serena rode beside the king of the Ironclaw realm through the winter dark with the bond warm at her throat, and the renunciation document against her ribs, and 12 men around them in the quiet forest, and she felt the thing she had been not feeling, the voluntary thing, the non-bond thing, the thing that was purely her own, move through her like the first real warmth she had encountered since stepping out of the tunnel. Not the warmth of resolution or safety or the fire she was riding toward. The warmer thing. The one that isn't about survival. She said nothing for a moment, then, "The grain merchant's name is Aldous Penny, and he has been shorting the castle's deliveries for 4 years. Kael looked at her. "I have documentation," she said, "in my father's accounts, which I have read thoroughly. 6 separate delivery records, each undercounted by between 3 and 8%. She paused. "Someone should do something about that." The quarter smile. "Someone," he said. "Someone with appropriate authority," she agreed. "We could send a letter," he said. "We could," she said. "Or I could handle it personally on the way out of the territory tomorrow, and it would take 20 minutes. He was quiet for a moment. Then, "You want to stop at the grain merchant on the way out of the territory." "I want to stop at the grain merchant on the way out of the territory," she confirmed. The amber eyes moved to her face, and in them was the thing she had first seen in the clearing. Not possession, not satisfaction, but recognition. Deepened now by everything that had happened since, the kind of recognition that doesn't diminish with proximity. 20 minutes, he said. 15, if he's cooperative, she said. The camp was exactly as they had left it. Fire rebuilt, horses settled. The 2 prisoners still sitting at the camp's edge with Devon's replacement watching them with the same patient attention. The counselor, a compact gray-haired man named Fenn who had the bearing of someone who had been handling the administrative consequences of dramatic events for a very long time, was waiting at the fire with the documentation spread across a flat camp chest, the ink dried, the seals set. He rose when they approached. "Completed," he said, addressing both of them with the equal directness of a man who has already recalibrated his understanding of who he is working for. He held out the documents. "The claiming bond documentation, formal notation of the mark, witness signatures from 9 of our party, and—" He produced a second set, smaller. "The sealed record from tonight, ready for Garrick's counter-signature." "He'll sign at dawn," Kael said, "before he leaves." Fenn nodded. "Ichamshin." Serena took the claiming bond documentation and looked at it, her name and Kael's. The date, it already felt further away than one night, the way significant things compress time around them. The witness signatures, the formal notation of the mark. She folded it and placed it inside her coat alongside the renunciation document, both documents against her ribs. Both earned, both permanent. She looked up at the fire. Around it, Kael's men were settling into the organized rest of people accustomed to short nights in the field. Davin was at the camp's far edge, back to the fire, watching the dark in the specific way of someone who is not worried but is not careless. The counselor had returned to his careful arrangement of documents. The horses were calm in the cold. It was, Serena thought, the most peaceful scene she had witnessed in 24 hours, which was not a high bar, but felt genuine anyway. Kael sat across the fire from her. She sat. They looked at the fire for a moment in the comfortable silence that had been building between them. The silence of people who have been through enough together in a short enough time that quiet has stopped being awkward and started being something else. "Tomorrow," she said. "Tomorrow," he agreed. "Garrick signs. We take care of Aldous Penny." The edge of a smile. Aldous Penny. "And then we ride for Ironclaw," she said. He looked at her across the fire. "And then," he said, "we ride for Ironclaw." She felt it then, fully, without qualification, without the pressed-down management she had been applying to her own interior since last night. The bond, yes, but also and separately and with its own complete character. The voluntary thing, the chosen thing, the thing that was not about survival or strategy or the absence of alternatives. The thing that had started in a cold clearing and a quarter smile and the phrase "she doesn't sound confused" and 6 months of remembered grain merchant arithmetic. The fire was warm. The documentation was inside her coat. Rowan Ashby had been publicly named and stripped of status, and the village had watched, and the people who had been listening to him that morning had stopped listening. Garrick had been brought to a hunting lodge and offered a choice and taken it. Her father had signed a document and looked away first from his own daughter for the first time in her memory. She was not finished. She knew she was not finished. There were still the matters of Ironclaw, of what it meant to walk into a wild kingdom as its new queen, of all the unnamed tests that came with a life rebuilt from scratch at the age of 19. The road ahead of her was long and unmapped, and the passes north of the territory were going to be cold in a way that Asheville winter had never prepared her for. But she was sitting at a fire in the northern forest with a king who had thought about her face for 6 months and documentation in her coat, and the first night of a life she had chosen entirely for herself just beginning to exhale around her. That was enough. More than enough. More than she had ever been given, and she had taken it herself and she was keeping it. She held her hands toward the fire and let it warm them and did not look back down the road toward the keep. The past was behind her. The dark was around her. The amber eyes across the fire were steady and gold and entirely, unhurriedly hers. Tomorrow they would ride north. Tonight, the fire was enough. Tonight, the fire was enough. But the night, as nights do, eventually ran out. She woke before dawn to the sound of horses and the smell of cold pine and the particular quality of darkness that precedes first light. Not black anymore, but a deep, saturated gray, the kind that carries the memory of the light coming. She had slept perhaps 4 hours on a bedroll that one of Kael's men had produced from somewhere with the wordless efficiency that characterized everything his party did. And she had slept without dreaming, which was its own small gift after the kind of day that breeds nightmares. The fire had burned down to coals. Kael was already up. He was standing at the camp's edge, speaking quietly with Davan and the counselor Fen, the three of them arranged around the flat camp chest in the posture of people concluding a conversation that had been going on for some time. He looked up when she rose, and she read nothing in his face except the alert, forward attention of a man whose thinking had already moved into the day ahead. "Garrick's messenger came an hour ago," he said, when she crossed to them. She looked at him. "A messenger." "He won't be coming himself," Fen said. He had the carefully neutral voice of a man delivering information he expects to be found frustrating. "He sent Holt." Serena looked at the documents on the chest. "Did Holt bring a signed withdrawal?" "He brought a partial withdrawal," Fen said. "The survey challenge is dropped. The obligation records against your father's estate are included." He paused. "The clause releasing Garrick from any sealed record obligation is not. He's attempting to sign away the leverage without accepting the accountability. Serena stood in the cold dawn light and thought for precisely 3 seconds. Then Holt goes back, she said. Devon looked at her. He goes back, she repeated, with the message that the partial withdrawal isn't the arrangement. The arrangement is what I described last night, complete, or the proceeding opens this morning as planned. She held Fenn's gaze. How long does it take to open a pack law proceeding? An hour to notify, Fenn said. 2 to assemble. The hall would be open by mid-morning. Then Holt has until mid-morning, she said. Fenn looked at Kael. Kael was looking at Serena with those amber eyes and the expression she had been learning the vocabulary for. The steady, ungaudy respect of a man watching someone operate at the level he had estimated they would reach, and finding the estimation confirmed. Mid-morning, he said to Fenn. Fenn folded the partial documents with the precise, slightly offended movements of a man who takes incomplete paperwork personally and went to find Holt. Holt was at the camp's perimeter, sitting on his horse with the upright, thin-shouldered posture of a man maintaining dignity through the application of good spine. He had the look of someone who had been awake most of the night and had made several calculations about his own future over the course of it. When Serena walked out to him alone, without Kyle, he looked down at her from the horse with an expression that was careful and newly attentive in a way his expression in the great hall had not been. "Steward Holt," she said. "My lady," he said. Old habit. He heard it himself, she thought, because something crossed his face. "Take the documents back to Lord Garrick," she said. "Tell him the terms are complete or they're not terms. Tell him he has until the morning bell at the village." She paused. "And tell him one other thing from me, personally." Holt waited. "Tell him that I don't bear him specific ill will," she said. She meant it, and she let the meaning be audible, because she had found that people could tell when you meant something, and it changed the character of what they did with it. "Tell him I understand that he spent 2 years building toward an arrangement that fell apart in a single night, and that's a genuine loss. But I need him to understand that the loss was always going to happen, because I was never going to be the person he built the arrangement for." She looked up at Holt steadily. "The woman he contracted for didn't exist. She was a story my father told himself and told Garrick, and it was never true." She paused. "The sooner he accepts the terms and moves forward, the sooner he can build something based on an accurate understanding of what is actually in front of him. That tends to produce better outcomes." Holt looked at her from the horse for a long moment. Something in his thin, precise face changed. Not dramatically, but definitively, the way a room changes when you open a window in it. "I'll tell him," Holt said. He turned the horse and rode east. The morning bell at Asheville Village rang at the 7th hour. The complete documents arrived at 20 minutes before it, carried by Holt on the same horse, signed in full, sealed, with a cover letter in Garrick's hand that was 3 sentences long and said nothing beyond the formal acknowledgement of terms. No elaboration, no explanation, no counteroffer. Just the signature and the seal and the 3 sentences. It was, Serena thought, the most honest communication she had received from Lord Garrick in the entire affair. It had the directness of a man who had run out of room to maneuver and had decided to exit cleanly rather than expend further resources on a position that couldn't be held. She respected that, in a detached, purely structural way. She handed the documents to Fenn, who received them with the satisfied gravity of a man reunited with something he had expected to have to fight for and was pleased not to. Then she asked Kael for an hour. He gave it without question. The village of Asheville in early morning had a different quality than it had the day before. It was not a dramatic difference. The buildings were the same. The square was the same. The well and the cooperage and the tavern and the smithy all stood exactly as they had stood through everything that had happened in the past 24 hours. But the people moving through it looked at her differently. She noticed it immediately, in the way you notice a change in wind direction, not loudly, not with announcement, but as a distinct and verifiable shift in the air. The woman at the baker's door who had watched her in the square yesterday morning with the expression of a person watching an accident about to happen looked at her now and nodded. Not with warmth, exactly. They did not know each other, and a nod was the appropriate register for strangers. but with a quality in the nod that was different from ignoring. That was acknowledging. A man crossing the square with a bundle of firewood stopped and looked at her, and then looked at the mark on her throat, and then looked back at her face and said simply, "Morning, my lady." She had been called my lady by the village her entire life, her father's daughter, the Lord's girl, a title of deference that was about who her father was, and nothing else. This was the same words and a different sentence. She could not have explained the difference to anyone who hadn't grown up spending their life listening for it. She went to Breta. Breta was in the kitchen garden behind the keep's outer wall, pulling something out of the frozen soil with the methodical persistence of a woman who has been getting useful things from difficult ground for 40 years. She looked up when Serena arrived and straightened and waited without speaking, which was Breta's way of giving someone the floor. "I came to say goodbye," Serena said. Breta looked at her. "You're going north. Today." Breta nodded. She looked at the mark on Serena's throat with the knowing eyes of a woman whose grandmother had been from Pack territory, who understood the bond the way people understand things that are part of their inherited knowledge rather than their acquired knowledge. "He's a good one," Breta said. It was not a question. "I think so," Serena said. "You don't just think so," Breta said, with the patient bluntness of a woman who did not have time for false modesty. "You know so. I saw his face in the square when those men went for you." She paused, hands still dirty from the garden. "A man who looks at a woman like that in the middle of a fight didn't just sign a legal document and ride north." She looked at Serena steadily. "You chose well. Under worse conditions than most people manage in better ones." Serena felt the thing behind her sternum, the same complicated water-through-rock feeling she'd had in her father's study. "Thank you," she said, "for telling me what was being said in the courtyard. For not," she paused, "for not being the kind of person who looks away." Breta made a sound that was not quite dismissive and not quite modest, the sound of a woman who considers honesty a practical matter rather than a virtue. "Someone should have been telling you things for years," she said. "That's not heroism. That's just the minimum." She held out her hand. In it, small and slightly muddy from the garden, was a sprig of something. Juniper, dark green and sharp-smelling, the kind that grew along the northern approaches and bloomed reliably through the worst of winter. "For the road," Breta said. "We have a saying where my grandmother was from. Carry the needle leaf north, and the cold knows you're not afraid of it." Serena took it. She held it for a moment and looked at the woman who had given it to her, a person she had known most of her life as part of the background of her imprisonment, who turned out to have a grandmother from Pack territory and a direct tongue and the minimum decency that some people made look like extraordinary virtue by contrast. "I'll come back," Serena said. "Not to stay, but I'll come back through." Breta nodded. "I'll still be here," she said, and returned to the garden. The grain merchant's name was Aldous Penny, and he was a man of 60, with the well-fed look of someone who had been skimming margins for so long he had stopped registering it as a moral act and had reclassified it as a professional skill. He was behind his counter when Serena and Kyle walked in, Davon behind them, Fen at the door. The shop was small and smelled of dried grain and hemp rope and the particular dusty warmth of spaces that are always slightly too closed. Penny looked at Serena. He looked at Kyle. He looked at the mark on her throat. He looked at Kyle again, and something happened in his face that was the specific expression of a man connecting several pieces of information very quickly and arriving at a conclusion he found uncomfortable. "My lady," he said, carefully. Serena placed 6 documents on his counter. They were the delivery records she had mentioned to Kyle the night before, the 6 instances, neatly copied from her father's accounts in her own hand during the hour she had asked for, showing the precise discrepancy in each delivery. She had known these numbers by memory since she was 16 and had first identified the pattern in her father's ledgers. She had noted it, cataloged it, and been unable to act on it because acting on it meant going to her father, which meant a conversation about why she had been reading his ledgers, which meant a punishment she had not been prepared to absorb at 16 for a benefit she could not have measured. She was prepared now. She could measure things clearly now. 6 deliveries, she said, over 4 years. Totaling She looked at Penny with the calm directness of a person who is not angry but is very certain. Approximately 240 pounds of grain, underweighted by margins ranging from 3 to 8% per delivery. She paused. Sold elsewhere, I assume. Or absorbed into your own stock. The mechanism is less important than the total. Penny's well-fed face had gone through several colors and arrived at a kind of damp stillness. My lady, 240 pounds valued at current market price, plus the interest applicable to a 4-year debt under territorial commerce law, she said, payable to the Vale estate in coin before end of month. She held his gaze. The documentation stays with me. If payment is received as described, it stays sealed. If payment is not received, she paused. I will be interested to know how many other estates in this territory have been receiving Aldous Penny's careful arithmetic. The shop was very quiet. Kael, behind her and slightly to her left, had said nothing through all of this. She felt him there. The gravity of his presence, the warmth of the bond, the particular quality of his attention that she was learning to distinguish from ordinary observation. He was watching her the way he had watched her in the village square, not as a protector supervising a ward, not as a king reviewing a subordinate, as a person watching another person do something that is entirely their own. Penny looked from Serena to Kael and back to Serena. He appeared to make a decision about which direction the relevant authority was located in, and the direction he settled on was not Kael. End of month, he said. The full amount. Good, Serena said. She collected the documents, tucked them inside her coat, and walked out of the shop. On the road outside in the pale winter morning with the horses waiting and the 12 men ready, and the whole northern world stretching out beyond the village boundary, she stopped and tilted her face up to the flat gray sky and breathed. Kael came out behind her. 15 minutes, she said. 13, he said. He agreed faster than average. She looked at him. I've seen a number of these conversations, he said with the mildest possible gravity. She made a sound that was, despite everything, a laugh. Small and genuine and surprised by itself, the way laughter is when it comes from somewhere you weren't expecting it to be. She pressed her fingers over her mouth for a moment and felt it subside. And when she lowered her hand, she felt lighter than she had in... She tried to calculate and gave up because the answer was longer than she wanted to think about. Kael was looking at her with those amber eyes. Ready, she said. Ready, he said. They mounted. They rode north. Bossi. The northern mountain passes began 40 miles from Ashvale. Everyone in the territory knew this, and most of them had never tested it personally. The passes were not forbidden exactly, but they were understood in the way that genuinely difficult things are understood. You could attempt them, and the attempt would judge you, and the judgment was not always in your favor. The road up into them climbed through progressively thicker forest before the trees thinned and the rock faces began, gray and ancient and indifferent to everything that moved between them. Serena had read about the passes in her father's library. She had read about them the way she had read about Ironclaw, with the concentrated attention of a person who suspects that the information will be useful someday and has decided to collect it against that eventual day. The reading had not fully prepared her. They reached the approach to the first pass in the late afternoon, the light already going gold and horizontal across the rock faces, and she pulled her horse to a stop at the edge of where the forest ended and the stone began, and she looked up. The pass was a vertical mile of gray rock and ice, a narrow cleft between two peaks that looked, in the late light, like the parted hands of something enormous that had simply stopped in mid-motion and remained that way for several thousand years. The wind that came through it was not the northern wind she had grown up with, the Ashvale wind, which was cold but navigable, which had human weather mixed into it. This wind was something older and simpler. It came down through the stone, and it did not carry anything from below. It was purely itself. How long, she said. 4 hours in good conditions, Kael said. He was looking at the pass with the neutral assessment of a man who has been through it many times and is deciding whether today's conditions qualify as good. We should camp below tonight. Go through at first light. She looked at the pass. She looked at the fading light. She thought about everything behind her. The tunnel, and the square, and the great hall, and the lodge, and the camp, and Breda's garden, and Aldous Penny's face, and she thought about everything ahead, the whole unmapped territory of it. "Tonight," she said. He looked at her. 4 hours in good conditions, and we're through before midnight," she said. "We camp on the other side." She held his gaze. "I don't want to sleep on this side again." He held her gaze for a moment, then, "Devon." "Already heard," Devon said from behind them. "Torches are in the rear pack. Cress has the mountain rope." Cale looked at Serena. "Tonight," he said. They rode into the pass. It was the hardest physical thing she had ever done. She understood this clearly about halfway through, when the cold had moved past being a sensation and had become a condition. Something she existed inside rather than something that was happening to her. The path through the pass was not a road, it was the memory of a road, a suggestion left in the rock by centuries of people who had needed to get from one side to the other and had found the most viable line through. It switchbacked up through the first pitch with a gradient that required the horses to work at a careful, deliberate pace, picking each placement, and then narrowed on the second pitch to something that was barely 2 horse widths across with a drop on the left side that the torchlight revealed in brief, definitive glimpses and then mercifully took back. She did not look at the drop. She looked at the path. She looked at the horse's ears. She looked at Kyle ahead of her, and she looked at the rock face to her right. And she breathed in the cold that had no history in it, and she held the juniper sprig in her coat pocket, and she kept moving. The wind through the pass had a voice, not a human voice, nothing like that, but a voice in the sense that it carried information. It told her, in the raw sensory language of wind through stone, that she was very small, and that the mountains had been here a long time before her, and would be here a long time after, and that this fact was not hostile. It was simply true, and the truth of it was, unexpectedly, a comfort, because a world that had existed for that long without requiring anything from her was a world that was not organized around her limitation. It was organized around nothing. It simply was. She had never had that before, the sense of a world that was indifferent in the clean, prejudgment sense. Every space she had ever occupied had been organized around who she was supposed to be. Even the library, which she had loved, had been inside a building that belonged to a man who had decided what she was. The past did not know who she was. The mountains had never heard of Lord Aldrich Vale. She found she was crying, slightly, at some point on the third pitch. Not from the cold, or the exertion, or the fear, though all three were present. From the specific releasing quality of being anonymous inside something ancient, of being just a person on a horse moving through stone. She did not wipe her face. The wind dried it anyway. They came through the top of the pass at the second hour, the narrow, wind-blasted crest where you could stand with one foot on each slope and look south toward everything she had left and north toward everything she was riding toward. And she stopped her horse at the top and looked north for the first time. The Ironclaw territory spread below her and beyond, vast and dark and alive with the cold, in a way that the southern territories were not alive with it. This cold was inhabited. She could feel it. Not the bond this time, not the claiming mark, but something older and more environmental, the sense of a land that was accustomed to its own nature and had not been apologizing for it. Pine forest, dense and black in the dark, spreading to the horizon. A river catching moonlight somewhere far below. And beyond the forest, barely visible, the lights of something. A settlement, a community. A place that had been there for a very long time and knew it. Ironclaw. Kyle pulled his horse to a stop beside her. He looked at what she was looking at. "Home," she said. It came out quietly, without her having planned it, and the specific register of a word said the first time you mean it in a new way. He looked at her. "Home," he said. They started down. The camp they made on the northern side of the pass was different from the camp below Ashvale. The air was different, denser with pine resin, quieter, the wind coming from different directions in a way that felt personal, as though the territory was determining its own weather rather than receiving someone else's. The fire Kyle's men built pulled straight up without the crosswind that had moved it the night before. She sat at the fire and felt the exhaustion of the pass in every muscle, and she felt the warmth of the fire. And she looked at the 12 men around her. Devon, with his careful eyes, Cress, who had the mountain rope and had used it twice on the third pitch, with the practiced calm of someone for whom this was simply an aspect of his job. Fen, the counselor, reading something in the firelight, with the dedicated myopia of a man who will read wherever there is light. The others whose names she was still collecting and whose natures she was still mapping. Kael sat beside her, not across the fire this time. Beside. She was aware of the shift. She thought he was aware of it too. Tomorrow, she said. We reach the lowland territory by midday, he said. The outer settlement by afternoon, Ironclaw itself by the following morning. What is Ironclaw like, she said. She had read about it. She wanted to hear him describe it. He was quiet for a moment, looking at the fire. Loud, he said. This surprised her. It was not what she had expected first. The main hall is very large, and it is almost always occupied, and people feel free to speak in it at full volume on any topic that interests them. He paused. It is not a quiet place. It is not a place organized around formality or approved behavior. He glanced at her sideways. You will probably find things to reorganize. She looked at him. The account keeping, he said carefully, has been managed by a man named Bard for the past 6 years who is very good at his job in the field and very bad at documentation. How bad? He lost 2 years of trading records in a flood that would not have affected properly stored documents, Kael said, with the scrupulous evenness of a man carefully not expressing an opinion. I see, she said. The kitchen arrangements have not been reviewed since my mother managed them, which was 11 years ago. She looked at him steadily. How long have you been waiting to tell me this? Something moved in his expression. Since the grain merchant, he said. She held his gaze. Your mother, she said. It was the first time she had said anything about his family. She did it carefully, the way you open a door you haven't been through before. Not carelessly, but not timidly either. He was quiet for a moment. She died 8 years ago, he said. Her name was Mira. She was from a human territory in the eastern ranges, not unlike yours in some respects. Her father had arranged a political alliance. He paused. She agreed to it. She wanted to, I think. She was good at seeing what a thing could be rather than what it was. He looked at the fire. She would have found you very interesting. Because I also agreed to a political alliance in the dark outside a tavern, Serena said. The amber eyes came to her face. Because you calculated your way through the worst night of your life and came out the other side with better numbers than you went in with, he said. She appreciated that. She thought clearly under pressure. She thought it was the most important thing a person could do. Serena held this for a moment, the specificity of it, the trust in the specificity, the understanding that he was giving her something he had not given many people, and that he was giving it to her in this quiet, careful way because he had decided she was someone who would handle it correctly. I would have liked her, Serena said. Yes, Kael said. I think so. The fire settled between them. Around the camp, the northern forest was very still, the kind of stillness that is not absence, but fullness. A stillness because the night was complete, because everything in it had found its place. I need to tell you something, Serena said. He waited. I have been managing, she said. She looked at the fire, choosing the words with the care she brought to every important calculation. Since the tunnel. I have been processing things as they arrived and making decisions and keeping the structural elements of myself functional because that was what the situation required. She paused. I am still doing that, and I think I will continue doing it for a while because there is a great deal ahead and I am still 19 years old and this is still the first real night of a life I have never lived before. She looked at him. I want you to know that I understand what I agreed to. Last night, in the clearing. I understand it was permanent and I chose it with a clear mind and I do not regret it. She held his gaze. And I also want you to know that the other thing, the voluntary thing, the thing that isn't the bond, I need time for that to grow at its own speed. Kael looked at her with those amber eyes for a long, quiet moment. Yes, he said, unhurried, unqualified, just yes. The yes of a man who had already accounted for this, who had given it room, who was not waiting with a specific timeline in mind. She felt the thing in her chest settle. I'll start with Bard's account records, she said. The amber eyes warmed. He will resist. I look forward to it, she said. They reached the outer settlement of the Ironclaw territory in the early afternoon of the following day, as Kyle had predicted, and the settlement was the first place she encountered that was neither like where she had come from nor like anything she had imagined. It was a village, structurally. Low buildings, central square, community well, but the scale of it was different. The buildings were larger, built for more people, and the people in them were more various than anything she had grown up in proximity to. Pack families and human families living in such close adjacency that the distinction was architectural rather than social. You could see it in the building styles, but you could not see it in the way people moved through the square together, which was with the easy, unself-conscious familiarity of people who have been neighbors long enough that the initial categories have worn smooth. The people looked at her. She had expected scrutiny. She had prepared for scrutiny. What she had not precisely anticipated was the character of it, not the inventory assessment she had received her entire life. The political reading of her value as an object of arrangement, but something more direct than that. They were reading her the way the mountains had been the wrong metaphor for her father, not with indifference, but with the honest, unbuffered attention of people who were trying to determine what kind of person she was and had no protocol for pretending they weren't trying. It was, strangely, the most respectful scrutiny she had ever been subjected to. A woman near the well, large, mid-40s, with the bearing of someone who managed a great deal and was good at it, looked at Serena and then looked at the mark on her throat, and then looked at Kyle, and then looked back at Serena with an expression that moved from assessment to something warmer in the space of a few seconds. "My king," the woman said. "Sarah," Kyle said. Not my lady, not steward, just her name, the easy directness of equals. "This is Serena. She will be staying." Sarah looked at Serena. "Staying as," she said, not rudely, as a genuine question. "As queen," Kyle said. Sarah looked at Serena for a moment that was not short. "You rode through the pass last night," she said. "Yes," Serena said. "In the dark." "We had torches," Serena said. Something moved in Sarah's face. "That pass has turned back people twice your age," she said. "People who have lived in mountain territory their whole lives." "It was difficult," Serena said honestly. "I cried on the third pitch." Sarah looked at her. "Good," Sarah said, in the decisive tone of a woman for whom this was relevant information. "It means you were paying attention." She turned back toward the well, and then paused and looked back over her shoulder. "Welcome to the north, my queen. Bard is in the counting house if you're looking for something to do. He's been waiting for someone to sort him out for 6 years." She walked away. Serena looked at Kyle. He was looking at the middle distance with the expression of a man who had known exactly that this was going to happen and had no intention of saying so. "Bard," she said. "Counting house," he agreed. She found the queen's work in unlikely places first, the way you find most important things. Bard turned out to be a man of 50, with the honest, exasperated face of someone who knows his own weakness and has been living with it for long enough that he has stopped finding it embarrassing and started finding it inconvenient. He showed her the account records with the resigned directness of a man who has been holding a mess for so long that the relief of handing it to someone is greater than the embarrassment of the state it's in. She sat with the records for 2 hours that first afternoon, while Kyle dealt with the administrative accumulation of 3 weeks' absence, and she worked through Bard's system, which was not as disorganized as Kyle had suggested, she found, but was built around a set of assumptions about categorization that were internally consistent and wrong in a way that created compounding errors over time. The kind of wrong that takes genuine intelligence to do, paradoxically. Bard was not careless. He was a creative categorizer operating without external review. "This column," she said, showing him, "is combining 2 separate categories of trade obligation that have different reconciliation timelines. Everything downstream of this point is built on that conflation." She looked at him. It's fixable. It'll take about a week to restate the affected records. Bard looked at the column. He looked at her. He looked at the column again. 6 years, he said. A sound that was not quite a sigh. It's fixable, she said again. You're not bad at this. You're working with a flawed foundation. There's a difference. He looked at her with the expression of a man who had been told the problem was solvable after years of managing the problem as though it were structural. I was told, he said carefully, that the king had taken a mate. Yes, she said. I assumed. He paused with the honesty of a man who had already decided to abandon the assumption. Something different. Different how? She said. Ceremonial, he said. Formal. He looked at the account books between them. Not this. She looked at the account books. She thought about the tunnel and the satchel and the village square and the pass at night and Bretta's juniper and Sarah at the well. She thought about a girl who had spent 19 years reading every book in a locked castle because she was not allowed to do anything else with what she found. This is exactly what I am, she said. It's what I have always been. She looked at Bard steadily. I just finally got somewhere with space for it. The morning Serena Vale rode into Ironclaw's main seat, the great sprawling stone and timber complex that served as the kingdom's center of governance, residence, and daily life. It was raining. Not the cold, sleety rain of the northern territories she had grown up in, but a full, clean, heavier rain that came straight down and smelled of pine and mineral and the particular wet earth quality of ground that was used to holding water. The horses' hooves on the courtyard stones made a different sound in the rain than they would have in the dry, and the courtyard itself was wider than anything she had seen before, with a scale that was neither intimidating nor casual, but simply proportionate, built for the actual number of people who used it rather than for the impression it was supposed to make. People came out. Not in formal arrangement, not in the organized presentation of a court greeting a new arrival. They came out the way people come out when something has returned that they had been waiting for. In ones and twos and small groups, from doorways and from the covered colonnade along the eastern wall, with the spontaneous movement of a community responding to itself. They looked at Kael. They looked at Serena. She sat on her horse in the rain with the bond warm at her throat and the juniper sprig in her coat pocket and the counting house documentation in her bag and the renunciation document against her ribs, and she looked back at them with the steady, clear attention of a person who has decided that being looked at is not something to manage but something to meet. An older man came forward from the colonnade, very tall, gray-haired, with the bearing of someone whose authority was so established it no longer needed to announce itself. He looked at Kael. He looked at Serena. He looked at the mark. Well, he said. Corvan, Kael said. Something in his voice when he said it, the warmth of long familiarity, the particular ease of people who have known each other through difficult things. She rode the night pass, Corvan said. Not a question. He had presumably been told. First crossing, Kael said. Corvan looked at Serena with eyes that were old and measuring in the way of someone who has measured many things over many years and whose standards are correspondingly specific. First crossing is the worst one, he said. I know that now, she said. Does it change how you feel about what's ahead? She thought about this with the seriousness he was offering it with. Not as a challenge, she thought, but as a genuine inquiry. The question of a man who has watched people arrive at thresholds and wants to know what she is made of, not because the answer would determine her welcome, but because he was genuinely curious. No, she said. It changes how I feel about what's behind me. She held his gaze. The thing behind me was harder, actually. The pass was only one night. Corvan looked at her for a moment. Then he nodded, the nod of a man who has made a judgment and is satisfied with it. Welcome home, my queen, he said. The great hall of Ironclaw was, as Kael had promised, loud. She stood in the doorway of it in the late afternoon of her arrival, dried from the rain, changed into clothes that had been produced from somewhere by Sarah. With the same decisive efficiency the woman brought to everything, and she looked at the hall, the fire at its center, the long tables, the 60 or 70 people occupying it in the various configurations of a community at the end of a day, talking, laughing, arguing about something near the far wall that seemed to involve the apportionment of a hunting territory, children at the low table nearest the fire, a very large man asleep sitting up against the wall. She looked at it, and she felt the thing she had felt at the top of the pass, coming down the north side. Not the cold, anonymous clarity of the mountains, but the full, warm, inhabited density of people who lived in the world she was entering. Her world. She had not had a world before. She had had a room, and a library, and a view of a courtyard, and a father's calculations, and a life that was arranged around the preferences of people who had never asked her what she preferred. She had a world now. She had taken it herself. She had walked out of a tunnel on a cold night with everything she owned in a bag, and she had listened in an alley, and she had made a decision that most people would have called reckless, and she had been right, and the rightness of it was not a simple thing, was not the clean victory of a story that had decided in advance what kind of ending it was going to have. It was complicated, and it was expensive, and it had cost things she had not expected, and it was going to cost things she could not yet predict. But it was hers. All of it. Entirely, unreservedly hers. Kyle came to stand beside her. He looked at the hall. "Still loud," she said. "Always," he said. She looked at the large man asleep against the wall. "Is that Bard?" Cale looked. A pause. "Yes." "He does the accounting sitting up and the sleeping sitting up," she said. "That's efficient." Cale looked at her sideways. "I'm going to fix his records," she said. "And then I'm going to look at the kitchen accounts. And then I want to understand the trading network between the outer settlements and the main seat, because the pattern in Bard's numbers suggests there's a lag in the reconciliation cycle that's probably costing the territory money every quarter." "You've been here 6 hours, Kyle said. "I've been doing this in my head since I was 15, she said. "I just didn't have anywhere to put it." He looked at her for a long moment, the amber eyes in the firelight, the hall loud around them, the rain coming down on the stones outside, clean and cold and northern. She turned to look at him. "Thank you," she said. He looked at her. "For what?" "For the door," she said. "I know I walked through it myself, but someone had to be standing there." He held her gaze. "You would have found another door," he said, quietly, with the simple certainty of someone describing physics. "Maybe," she said, "but I'm glad it was this one." The fire moved in the great hall. The voices of 60 people rose and fell around them, the warm and living noise of a community that did not require anyone to be smaller than they were. Outside, the rain came down on the ironclaw stones, and the pine forest dripped, and the mountains stood where they had always stood, indifferent and ancient and absolutely unmoved by the fact that a young woman from the south had ridden through them last night and come out the other side. Serena Vale, the girl who had been a pawn, the daughter who had been a contract term, the woman who had listened in an alley and made a choice in a clearing and stood in a village square and walked through a mountain pass in the dark, stood in the doorway of the great hall of Ironclaw and felt the whole real weight of the life ahead of her. It was heavy. It was complicated. It was entirely, irrevocably hers. She stepped through the door.